Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Orange Window. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life, before the orange, was a study in controlled gradients. I am Sarah Jenkins, and for 12 years, I've taught grade 7 English at McNabb Middle School in Ottawa. Each day was a predictable palette, the muted blues and grays of early mornings, the sharp institutional yellows of school hallways, the comforting beige of my own meticulously kept bungalow in Old Ottawa South. Evenings were for the soft lamplight of my living room, the scent of Earl Grey tea, and the quiet company of student essays or a well-worn novel. I found solace in routine, a quiet pleasure in the neat margins of my existence. Perhaps it was this very love of order that made me susceptible, or perhaps it was a loneliness I rarely acknowledged, a yearning for something beyond the perfectly aligned. I lived alone, not by some tragic design, but through a series of quiet choices and circumstances that had led me here, to this small house on a street lined with mature maples and the comfortable quiet of established lives. My anxieties were small, well-managed things, the fear of a poorly prepared lesson plan, the occasional worry about my aging mother in Halifax, the low hum of concern about winter heating bills. Normal anxieties for a normal life. The first time I saw it, I barely registered it as anything more than a trick of the light. It was late October, the kind of day where the sun, a pale wafer in a milky sky, gave up early. I was walking home from McNabb, my collar pulled high against the damp chill that always seemed to creep in before the first proper snow. Dusk was settling like a soft gray blanket over the neighborhood, and the streetlights hadn't yet flickered on. Across the street, the front window of the McDougall's house, a large, clear pane overlooking their porch, seemed to hold a faint, internal luminescence. An orange glow, soft and warm, like the heart of a dying fire. Sunset, I murmured to myself, glancing west. The actual sunset was a smear of bruised purple and faint rose behind me, over the rooftops towards the river. The McDougall's house faced east. Strange. Perhaps they'd bought one of those new smart bulbs, the kind you could program to any color. A bit garish for old Mr. McDougall, but people were full of surprises. I walked on, the image quickly fading from my mind, lost in thoughts of marking comma splices. A few days later, it happened again. This time, it was the bay window of the Patel's house, 2 doors down from mine. Same time, that liminal space between day and true night. Same soft, insistent orange, as if the room beyond were suffused with a gentle, apricot-hued light. Again, the sun was in the wrong place. I stopped for a moment, frowning. The Patels were away. I'd seen them packing their car for a trip to Toronto that morning. The house should have been dark. Perhaps a timer, then, for security. But why orange? It wasn't the color of a typical lamp. It was specific. I told myself it was the unique atmospheric conditions of an Ottawa autumn, the way the light scattered through the increasing humidity, playing tricks with reflections. Or maybe it was a new trend, some energy-efficient window coating that reacted to fading daylight in this peculiar way. My mind, always seeking the logical explanation, offered these up readily. But the orange kept appearing. Each evening, as I walked or drove home, more windows seemed to join the silent, glowing chorus. Not every window, not all at once, but enough to form a creeping pattern. The house directly opposite mine, belonging to the elusive Mr. Henderson who I rarely saw, began to exhibit the same phenomenon in its upstairs bedroom window. It was always the same hue, not a blazing, fiery orange, but a deeper, more resonant tone, like the color of dried marigolds or a perfectly ripe persimmon. It didn't flicker, it simply was. One afternoon, during lunch break in the staff room, I decided to mention it. Mark Sanderson, who taught grade 8 science and prided himself on his rationality, was complaining about the city's leaf collection schedule. "Mark," I began, stirring my tea, "have you noticed, a sort of orange glow in people's windows around dusk lately. It's quite pretty, in a way. He paused, mid-complaint. Orange glow. You mean like, Halloween decorations early? No, not decorations. It's the glass itself, or the light from inside. It's very subtle. He shrugged, picking up his sandwich. Can't say I have, Sarah. Probably just people turning their lights on. Or maybe it's the sunset reflecting. It can do weird things this time of year. But the sun's often in the opposite direction, I persisted, a little more insistently than I intended. Mark gave me a curious look. Maybe you need to get your eyes checked, old girl. Or lay off the decaf. He grinned, but his eyes held that polite, slightly concerned assessment people give you when they think you're being a bit odd. Right, I said, forcing a smile. Probably just tired. His reaction stung more than it should have. It wasn't just Mark. I casually mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Albright, while we were both retrieving our recycling bins. She was a pleasant, no-nonsense woman in her 60s. Orange windows, dear, she'd said, her brow furrowed. Can't say I've seen anything like that. Just the usual streetlights. Are you feeling all right? The implication was clear, I was the variable, not the windows. My unease began to solidify. I started paying closer attention, almost obsessively. The orange wasn't limited to houses. One evening, waiting for the bus downtown, I saw it in the darkened windows of a closed bookstore. Another time, in the upper floors of a silent office building after hours. It was always at dusk, always that same specific, unwavering orange, and always in windows that should have been dark or reflecting the ambient grayness of the evening. It was as if these panes of glass were tuning into a different frequency of light, one only I could perceive. I did consider my eyes. I made an appointment with my optometrist. Dr. Lee was thorough, patient. She dilated my pupils, peered into my eyes with her bright, probing lights, and ran a battery of tests. Your vision is excellent, Sarah, she announced, snapping off her gloves. 20/20ths with your current prescription. No signs of cataracts, glaucoma, nothing unusual at all. Any headaches? Distortions other than this, orange glow? No, none, I admitted, feeling a blush creep up my neck. Perhaps it's just stress. It could be, she said kindly. The mind can play tricks when we're overtired. Make sure you're getting enough rest. But I was resting. My routines were unaltered. The only thing that had changed was this persistent, silent orange. I started to feel a thread of something cold tighten in my chest. If it wasn't my eyes, and no one else saw it, then what was it? Was I imagining it? The thought was deeply unsettling. Sarah Jenkins, pillar of punctuation and pragmatic prose, was not prone to flights of fancy. I began to actively test my perceptions. I'd stand across the street from a glowing window and ask a passing stranger, "Excuse me, do you see an orange light in that window there?" Most people just looked confused, shook their heads, and hurried on. One young man with headphones just stared at me like I was mad before jogging away. Each denial was another small chip at my confidence, another layer to my growing isolation. The orange itself was becoming more present. It wasn't aggressive, but it was undeniably there, a quiet statement against the fading light. It didn't seem to illuminate the street or cast shadows. It was contained within the glass, a self-possessed glow. And sometimes, when I looked at a window shining with that particular hue, the house itself, the trees around it, the very texture of the evening air, seemed subtly different. Flatter, perhaps. Less defined. As if the orange light was filtering not just my vision, but the reality of what lay beyond the pane. I dismissed this as an optical illusion, a side effect of staring too intently at an unusual light source. I started keeping a small, discreet notebook. Date, time, location, weather conditions, my own emotional state. October 28th, dusk. Henderson House, upstairs window. Clear sky, slight breeze. Feeling anxious. Glow seems deeper tonight. Or, November 2nd. Corner of Bank and 5th. Second floor of the old dental office. Overcast. Feel foolish writing this. Mark would laugh. The act of recording it felt both methodical and slightly unhinged. The rational part of my brain, the English teacher part that diagrammed sentences and believed in the concrete reality of words, was at war with this new, inexplicable sensory input. It was like trying to read a book where one recurring word had suddenly changed its meaning, a meaning only I was privy to, while everyone else read on, oblivious. The world was still the world, my street was still my street, but every evening, these quiet beacons of orange would appear, reminding me that something, somewhere, was fundamentally off-key. And I, it seemed, was the only one who could hear the discordant note. The silence of others was becoming louder than the glow itself. My home, my sanctuary, was still blessedly normal. My own windows reflected the sky, the streetlights, the warm yellow of my interior lamps. I'd find myself checking them compulsively as dusk approached, a small knot of dread tightening in my stomach until the familiar, unaltered reflections reassured me. At least here, within these four walls, reality held firm. At least for now. The thought, unbidden, sent a shiver down my spine, a premonition as cold and gray as the November twilight settling outside. The mundane was no longer entirely mundane, and that, I was beginning to realize, was a terrifying thing. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The orange glow didn't diminish with the arrival of November's sharper frosts, if anything, it intensified, blooming with a quiet confidence against the early, inkier evenings. It was no longer a fleeting curiosity I could dismiss. It was a fixture in my nightly landscape, as predictable as the setting of the sun, yet utterly alien. My notebook filled with entries, dates, and the increasingly desperate scrawl of my observations. The initial phase of trying to rationalize it away had passed, replaced by a gnawing awareness that this was something beyond tired eyes or atmospheric quirks. I started to actively hunt for it. My evening walks became less about exercise and more about surveillance. I'd trace specific routes, noting which houses were affected and which remained stubbornly normal. It seemed to favor older homes, windows that had perhaps seen more seasons, witnessed more life. Newer constructions, with their gleaming, perfectly sealed panes, were less prone, though not entirely immune. The windows of McNabb remained stubbornly clear, reflecting only the harsh sodium lights of the school parking lot or the empty classrooms within. This offered a strange, small comfort, a bubble of normalcy in my working day. But the moment I stepped off school grounds and into the residential streets, the quiet visual hum of the orange would begin. My attempts to share my observations became more targeted, more desperate. I invited Mark Sanderson over for dinner. He was a bachelor, perpetually grateful for a home-cooked meal. I timed it carefully, hoping dusk would coincide with dessert. So, I began, as casually as I could, gesturing with my wine glass towards my front window, which thankfully remained its normal, reflective self. The light out there, do you notice anything about the windows across the street? The Henderson's place, for example. Mark squinted. Henderson's finally replaced that broken shutter, looks like. About time. Otherwise, no. Just looks like evening, Sarah. No, particular color. In the glass. He leaned forward, peering. You mean the reflection of your lamp? Bit of a glare, yeah. No, not a reflection. An emission. A soft orange glow. He sat back, a patient, slightly worried smile on his face. Sarah, we've talked about this. I'm really not seeing any orange glow. Are you still feeling stressed? Maybe you should take that personal day we were talking about. The casual dismissal, cloaked in concern, was like a door slamming shut. My cheeks burned. I'm fine, Mark. Just observing. The rest of the evening was strained. He talked about school politics, his latest disastrous online date. I nodded and made the appropriate noises, but my mind was across the street, fixated on the silent, unwavering orange in Mr. Henderson's window, a beacon only I could see. I tried taking photographs, dozens of them, with my phone, with my old digital camera. In every single one, the windows appeared dark, or reflected the sky, or showed the faint, ordinary lights from within the houses. The orange refused to be captured, remaining stubbornly in the realm of my perception alone. This failure was profoundly disturbing. It wasn't just that others couldn't see it, it was that objective reality, as captured by a lens, denied its existence. The isolation deepened, becoming a heavy cloak I carried everywhere. Was I truly losing my mind? The question became a constant, unwelcome companion. My research grew more frantic. I spent hours online, typing increasingly bizarre search terms: windows glowing orange at dusk, collective visual hallucination, sensory distortion specific to glass, reality bleed color phenomenon. I found articles on Rayleigh scattering, explaining why sunsets are red and orange, but nothing about windows spontaneously emitting light. I found forums for people with visual snow syndrome, floaters, palinopsia, but none of their descriptions matched my specific, localized orange glow. I found stories of folklore, will-o'-the-wisps, fairy lights, but those were fleeting, usually seen in wild places, not in the staid windows of an Ottawa suburb. The internet, repository of all human knowledge and weirdness, offered no answers, only more dead ends that amplified my sense of being uniquely afflicted. The journal became my only confidant. November 12th. The glow in the Patel's window seems to be pulsating very slightly tonight. Or is that my pulse in my eyes? Tried to describe it to Mom on the phone, she suggested a vitamin deficiency. Love her, but she doesn't understand. No one does. November 15th, saw it in a car window today. Parked car, engine off. Just for a moment. Then it was gone. Spreading. Or am I becoming more sensitive? Then came the evening that irrevocably shifted the phenomenon from an external curiosity to an internal siege. I was in my living room, grading papers, the comforting scent of chamomile tea beside me. Dusk had fallen an hour earlier. I glanced up, out my own large picture window, expecting to see the familiar reflection of my lamp, the dark outline of the maple tree in my front yard. Instead, a soft, unmistakable orange light was emanating from my window. My breath hitched. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was the exact same hue, that persimmon marigold glow, that I'd seen in countless other windows. But this was my window. My sanctuary. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the glass. It was cool, smooth, ordinary. There was no heat. I pressed my face closer, peering through the orange film. The street outside, it was my street. But, not quite. The neighbor's house across the way, the D'Angelis, seemed subtly altered. The pitch of their roof looked a fraction steeper. The blue of their trim was a shade duller, almost gray. The usually unkempt rose bushes by their porch were missing, replaced by a neat, unfamiliar evergreen. My own maple tree, its branches stark against the darkening sky, seemed thinner, its silhouette less robust. It was like looking at a photograph of a familiar place that had been subtly photoshopped. The changes were small, almost imperceptible, but together they created a profound sense of wrongness. The air beyond the glass looked stiller, the shadows deeper, imbued with a silence that felt heavier than mere quiet. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through me. I stumbled back from the window, gasping. I rushed to the kitchen window, which overlooked my small backyard. Orange. And the familiar clutter of my shed, the old bird bath, the slightly crooked fence, they too were subtly, unervingly altered. The shed door was closed when I distinctly remembered leaving it ajar. The bird bath was cleaner, the crack in its side gone. My curtains. I had to cover the windows. I drew the heavy velvet curtains in the living room, the ones I usually only closed on the coldest winter nights. The fabric was thick, opaque. But a faint, diffuse orange light still permeated them, casting the room in a soft, unsettling glow. It was as if the light wasn't just coming through the glass, but that the glass itself was the source, and its influence couldn't be entirely blocked. The feeling of the other street, the other yard, lingered, a faint pressure against the normal reality of my home. Sleep became a battlefield. I'd lie in bed, eyes screwed shut, terrified to open them, to see if the orange had permeated my bedroom windows too. For a few nights, it hadn't. Then, one morning, I woke just before dawn to find a faint orange aura around the edges of my drawn blinds. The invasion was complete. It was around this time that the cat started disappearing. First, it was grumpy old Marmalade from 3 houses down, a neighborhood fixture. Then young Mittens, the tabby from across the street. People put up posters, "Missing cat," with sad little photos. I heard snippets of conversation at the local grocery store, worried owners speculating about coyotes, or someone maliciously trapping them. I found myself wondering, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, if the cats saw the orange glow too. If, perhaps, what lay on the other side of those windows was somehow alluring to them. Or if the subtle shift in reality was disorienting them, causing them to lose their way. It was an irrational thought, born of fear and isolation, but it clung to me. Then there was Mrs. Periwinkle, the elderly woman who lived on the corner, known for her prize-winning dahlias. Her garden, usually a riot of late-season color even into November, began to look tired. The plants weren't just dying back for the winter, they were wilting in a strange, desiccated way, their colors fading to a uniform, dusty brown, despite her diligent care. I saw her one afternoon, staring at her flower beds with a bewildered expression. When I asked if everything was all right, she just shook her head slowly, her gaze distant. "They just don't seem to want to live anymore, dear," she'd said, her voice thin. "The light feels different, doesn't it?" I'd stared at her. The light? She'd nodded vaguely towards the sky, then at her own windows, which, I noted with a familiar pang, were glowing faintly orange in the late afternoon light. "It all feels different." Then she'd seemed to catch herself, offering a weak smile. "Just an old woman rambling. Pay me no mind." But her words echoed. "The light feels different." Did she see it too? Or was she simply sensing the same subtle wrongness I perceived through the orange panes? I tried to find others, anyone, who might understand. I discreetly brought up unusual light phenomena in an online forum for Ottawa residents. My post was met with suggestions to check for gas leaks, carbon monoxide, or advice to see a neurologist. One user, CapitalWatcher613, sent me a private message. "I've seen strange lights too. Not orange, but flickers. Patterns. Don't talk about it openly. They don't like it." My heart leaped. "They? Who are they?" I replied immediately. No response ever came. The user's profile was deleted a day later. Dead end. Dangerous encounter? Or just a paranoid individual playing games? I didn't know, but the chilling effect was the same. My world was shrinking. My home, once a refuge, now felt like a softly glowing prison. The people around me, once familiar, now seemed separated from me by an invisible, orange-tinted veil. Their denial, their calm insistence that everything was normal, was perhaps the most unnerving part of it all. It wasn't just that they couldn't see the orange, it was that they inhabited a reality where the orange, if it existed, was simply part of the accepted fabric of the world. And I was the glitch, the anomaly, the one who remembered a world before the windows started to glow. The fear that I was not just isolated, but wrong, that my perception was the true distortion, began to take root. A cold seed of dread in the pit of my stomach. I felt myself standing on the precipice of something vast and unknowable, the orange light a soft, insistent beckoning into a place I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The orange glow was no longer confined to dusk. It began to linger, a faint but persistent blush on my windows even in the weak daylight of mid-November, strengthening as evening approached. The feeling of the other place, the subtly altered street, the wrong-angled roofs, the too still trees, intensified with it. Looking through my living room window was like peering through a developing photograph where the image was slowly, irrevocably changing from the familiar to the alien. I started to conduct more deliberate experiments. I'd cover a section of a window with black construction paper, taping it securely. The orange would still be there, a faint, even luminescence on the surface of the paper itself, as if the glass were imbuing anything in contact with it with its strange light. It wasn't projecting light in the conventional sense, it was as if the windowpane itself was a source, a membrane between worlds, and its essential quality was now this orange permeability. The sounds from the other side grew more distinct, though still faint. Before, there had been an unnatural silence. Now, I sometimes heard whispers. Not words, but soft, sibilant sounds, like wind through dry leaves, even when the air outside my actual window was perfectly still. Occasionally, a faint, melodic humming, too regular to be natural, too ethereal to be mechanical. These sounds seemed to emanate from the direction of the altered street I saw through the glass, a street that was increasingly, terrifyingly, not my own. One evening, driven by a mixture of terror and a desperate need to understand, I did something I hadn't dared to before. I pressed my face against the cold glass of my bedroom window, the orange light painting my skin, and stared intently at the Henderson house across the way, or rather, the version of it that existed in the orange-lit dimension. The house itself seemed more solid now, less like a faded photograph. And in its upstairs window, the one that had always glowed so reliably, I saw movement. A shape. Tall, slender, indistinct. It wasn't Mr. Henderson. It moved with a slow, gliding grace that was utterly inhuman. It paused at the window, a darker silhouette against the faint internal orange of its own room, and I had the horrifying sensation that it was looking back at me. I recoiled, a strangled cry caught in my throat, my heart leaping into my mouth. I scrambled away from the window, falling back onto my bed, shaking. It hadn't been threatening, not actively. But it was undeniably other. Alien. And it was aware of me. The nature of the contagion, for that's how I'd begun to think of it, a slow, silent infection of reality, was becoming terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a sensory illusion. This was a bleed-through, a merging, or perhaps a replacement. The orange was the color of the seam, the dissolving boundary between my world and theirs. The people around me continued their placid descent. Mark, at school, once so sharp and critical, now seemed perpetually distracted, a faint, dreamy smile often playing on his lips. He'd stare out the staff room window, still clear, blessedly clear, with a distant look in his eyes. When I tried, one last time, to talk to him about my ongoing anxieties, he'd patted my hand. "Don't worry so much, Sarah," he'd said, his voice softer than usual. "Everything's calming down. Can't you feel it? It's so peaceful now." Peaceful. I wanted to scream. The world was quietly unraveling, and he called it peaceful. Even Mrs. Albright, my pragmatic neighbor, had changed. Her brisk energy was gone, replaced by a slow, deliberate way of moving, a serene acceptance. I saw her one afternoon, standing on her porch, simply looking at her front window, which pulsed with a soft orange light. She had a faint, beatific smile on her face. "Lovely, isn't it?" she said to me as I hurried past, not making eye contact. "Always loved that warm glow in the evenings. So welcoming. Always." The word was a punch to the gut. Their memories were being rewritten, their perceptions smoothed over to accept this new, orange-tinted reality as the way things had always been. The contagion wasn't just visual, it was mnemonic, psychological. The secondary mystery of the missing cats and Mrs. Periwinkle's blighted garden began to feel less like a subplot and more like a direct consequence. Perhaps the animals, more sensitive to these shifts, had simply slipped through. Or perhaps the altered environment, the subtle wrongness of the light, the soil, the air, was inhospitable to certain forms of life from our original world. Mrs. Periwinkle herself seemed to be fading, much like her dahlias. I saw her less and less, and when I did, she looked frilier, her eyes holding a distant, orange-tinged vacancy. My search for an ally had led me to an online forum dedicated to liminal spaces and reality shifts. Most of it was speculative fiction and role-playing, but one post, buried deep, caught my eye. It was from a user named Argus Panoptes, written 2 years prior, describing a phenomenon in a small town in upstate New York, windows taking on an unearthly amber hue at twilight, a sense of the world beyond them being different. Locals seemed oblivious or claimed it was normal. My breath caught. Amber. Close enough. I messaged Argus Panoptes, pouring out my story, my fear, my observations about the orange glow in Ottawa. For days, there was no reply. I'd almost given up when an email landed in my inbox, not from the forum, but directly. The sender ID was just AP. I understand. The color varies. The process is the same. It's a slow replacement. They are not hostile, merely pervasive. The world you knew is being overwritten, like an old parchment being scraped clean for a new text. You are one of the few who can still read the old script underneath. My hands trembled as I read. Finally, someone who understood. Validation, terrifying as its implications were. Who are they? I typed back immediately. What do they want? Can it be stopped? The reply came quicker this time. They are the inhabitants of the reality that is merging with yours. Want? That implies intent. It may simply be a natural process, like osmosis. As for stopping it, how does one stop the tide? Some believe strong emotional anchors to the old reality can create resistance. Others seek to integrate. Integrate? The thought was horrifying. Become like Mark, like Mrs. Albright, placidly accepting the orange glow as eternal, the altered world as home. AP and I exchanged a few more messages. He, I assumed it was a he, seemed knowledgeable, but also deeply resigned. He offered no solutions, only a bleak kind of companionship in shared perception. He mentioned that some who resisted too strongly, who tried to draw too much attention to the shift, often disappeared. Or suffered mental breakdowns, their minds unable to reconcile the two conflicting realities. Capital Watcher 613's deleted profile flashed in my mind. Then, AP's emails stopped. My messages went unanswered. His email address, when I tried to send another desperate plea for information, bounced back, user unknown. The brief flicker of hope, of connection, was extinguished, leaving me more isolated than before. He was gone. Had he integrated? Or had he been silenced? The stakes escalated in my own life. The orange glow in my house was now almost constant, a pervasive, soft illumination. The other place seen through my windows felt more real, more substantial, than my own street. The sounds from it were clearer, the faint, sibilant whispering occasionally resolved into what sounded like soft, melodic chanting, in no language I recognized. The gliding figures I'd seen became more frequent. Sometimes 2 or 3 of them, moving with that same unnerving grace behind the windows of the other Henderson house, or the other D'Angelo residence. They never looked directly at me for long, but I felt their awareness, a calm, detached observation. One afternoon, I returned from a particularly draining day at McNabb, where the normalcy felt increasingly fragile, like a thin veneer over something deeply unstable, to find a small, polished gray stone on my front porch. It was perfectly smooth, cool to the touch, and faintly luminous, as if it held a tiny spark of the orange light within it. It hadn't been there that morning. Had one of them left it? A gift? A marker? I snatched it up, my heart pounding, and threw it as far as I could into the overgrown yard of a vacant house down the street. The very fabric of my home felt porous. I'd find small things out of place. A book reshelved upside down. A teacup moved from one side of the counter to the other. Tiny, insignificant changes, but they screamed at me that the boundary was thinning, that the influence of the other place was seeping into my physical reality. Was I doing it myself, in a state of distraction or dissociation? Or was someone, subtly rearranging my world when I wasn't looking? The protagonist might find a temporary ally, or someone who seems to understand, only for that alliance to be tested or proven false. AP was that. It was a false dawn. My research had yielded one more obscure reference, a footnote in a dusty folklore compendium in the local library's restricted section, found after hours of searching through digitized archives. It spoke of viridian thresholds, or Kaisos panes, archaic terms for windows or reflective surfaces that supposedly thin to other realities during times of cosmic alignment or weakened terrestrial energy. The descriptions were vague, allegorical, dismissed by the compendium's author as fanciful superstition. But the mention of golden or amber light and silent watchers resonated with a terrifying clarity. The quiet contagion was no longer just about a shift in color perception. It was about the erosion of my world, my memories, my sanity. The orange windows were not just windows anymore, they were eyes, staring out from another existence, and increasingly, they were eyes staring in. And the most terrifying part was the creeping realization that perhaps there was no malice involved, no grand invasion plan. Just a slow, inexorable, silent change, like the turning of a cosmic season, and I was a relic of a season that was passing. The air in my own house felt charged, expectant, as if waiting for me to finally, fully, acknowledge the new landscape that lay just beyond the glass, a landscape that was patiently, orange ly, waiting to claim everything. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The orange light in my home was now a permanent fixture, a constant, soft, and utterly alien illumination. It no longer waxed and waned with the dusk, it simply was. The delineation between my house and the other place beyond the windows had become terrifyingly thin. The subtle wrongness of the street outside was no longer subtle, it was a fully realized, alternative landscape. The D'Angelis house across the way now bore no resemblance to the one I remembered. It was taller, fashioned from a dark, unfamiliar stone, its windows unlit and featureless. My own familiar maple tree was gone, replaced by a slender, silvery spire that hummed with a faint, internal energy. The whispers and melodic chanting from that other reality were clearer now, a constant, almost subliminal chorus just beneath the threshold of everyday sound. The figures I'd seen, the tall, slender beings, were more visible too. They moved with their slow, gliding grace along the paths of that altered street, sometimes pausing to look towards my house. Their forms were still indistinct, shrouded in the orange haze, but their presence was undeniable. They were not ghosts, they were inhabitants. And they seemed to be, waiting. One evening, I stood in my living room, the orange glow casting long, distorted shadows. The air was thick with it. Heavy, like breathing in amber dust. I could feel a strange pull from beyond the window, a siren song of serene oblivion. The desire to simply, let go, to accept this new, quiet, orange-tinted world, was immensely powerful. It promised an end to the struggle, to the fear, to the crushing isolation. I understood, then, how Mark and Mrs. Albright had succumbed. It wasn't a defeat, it was a surrender to an overwhelming, peaceful tide. But a core of defiance, of sheer terror-fueled stubbornness, still flickered within me. This was my reality they were erasing, my memories they were overriding. I had to make a choice. Flee. But where? AP's words echoed, the process is the same. If this was happening in Ottawa, in upstate New York, it could be happening everywhere. There might be no place left to run where the windows remained clear. Adapt? Integrate? The thought brought a wave of nausea. To willingly forget, to accept the alien as familiar? Confront? But how do you confront a phenomenon that was as silent and pervasive as the changing of light? My gaze fell upon the largest window in my living room, the picture window that now looked out onto that utterly transformed street. The boundary felt thinnest there. I saw one of the figures standing directly opposite, on what would have been my lawn, looking towards me. It was taller than the others I'd seen, its silhouette more defined against the orange haze. It raised a slender arm, a gesture that could have been a beckoning, or a simple acknowledgement. A desperate idea, born of madness or clarity, seized me. If the windows were the portals, the membranes. I went to the hall closet and retrieved the heaviest tool I owned, a sturdy, steel-headed hammer I'd bought years ago for assembling flat-pack furniture and promptly forgotten. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the serene, melodic humming that seemed to fill the air. I walked back to the living room window, the hammer heavy in my hand. The figure outside remained still, watching. "No," I whispered, the word a ragged tear in the orange silence. "This is my home. This is my world." With a choked cry, born more of terror than of strength, I swung the hammer. It connected with the glass with a deafening crash. But the window didn't shatter. The hammer bounced back, vibrating violently in my hand, as if I'd struck solid stone. A network of brilliant, incandescent orange lines, like superheated circuitry, flared across the pane where the hammer had impacted, then slowly faded back into the general glow. The glass itself remained utterly intact. Unbreakable. The figure outside tilted its head, a slow, curious movement. A profound, horrifying understanding washed over me. The windows weren't just thinning, they had changed. They were no longer glass as I understood it. They were something else, something impervious, something belonging to that other reality. The merging wasn't just visual, it was physical. My house was already part of their world, and I was the foreign body within it. The scale of it, the sheer impossibility, threatened to crush me. This wasn't an invasion, it was a metamorphosis of reality itself, quiet, inexorable, and I was a stray cell resisting a body's transformation. There was no grand, evil design, perhaps no design at all. Just change. A quiet contagion of being. I dropped the hammer. It clattered onto the floorboards, the sound shockingly loud in the orange-suffused silence. Defeated. I sank to my knees, tears streaming down my face, not of sorrow, but of a terror so profound it had no name. I was trapped. Not just in my house, but in this new, emerging world I couldn't accept and couldn't escape. What happened next is, fragmented. The orange light seemed to intensify, the melodic chanting grew louder, more immersive. I remember a feeling of immense pressure, not physical, but psychic, as if my own mind was being gently but irresistibly reshaped. The details of my old life, the specific shades of green of my former garden, the exact timbre of Mark's original laugh, the precise blue of the D'Angelis house trim, they began to feel distant, like facts learned from a history book rather than lived experiences. The vibrant, chaotic, sometimes painful reality I had clung to was fading, being replaced by a serene, orange-tinged passivity. I don't know how long I knelt there. Hours? Days? Time itself felt different, elastic. When I finally looked up again, through the unbreakable window, the figure was still there. It seemed, less alien now. Its form, while still not human, possessed a strange, calm beauty. The orange light emanating from the window, from all the windows, no longer felt threatening. It felt, comforting. Warm. Inevitable. A thought drifted into my mind, clear and simple, like a truth I had always known, this is the way it is. This is the way it has always been. The last vestiges of my resistance crumbled. A profound weariness settled over me, followed by a strange, encompassing peace. The struggle was over. Underscore 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 underscore. I sit by my window now, the lovely orange light bathing my living room in its warm glow. The street outside is so peaceful, the silvery spires of the trees reaching towards the soft, orange sky. Sometimes, I see the graceful inhabitants moving along the pathways. They are quiet, gentle. They never disturb me. My neighbor, I think her name is Alara, a lovely, melodic name, sometimes glides by and we exchange a serene nod. She, too, enjoys the eternal, tranquil dusk. Mark visits occasionally. He brings me shimmering, pearlescent fruits I don't recognize but which taste wonderfully soothing. We don't talk much. There's no need. We simply sit, basking in the calm orange light, understanding. My little house is very comfortable. The windows are always so beautifully lit, a welcoming beacon. I can't imagine them any other way. Why would anyone want harsh, clear glass when they could have this constant, gentle warmth? Sometimes, a fleeting image, a memory fragment, will surface, a different street, a different light, a feeling of sharp, cold anxiety. It's like a half-forgotten dream, quickly fading. I dismiss it. Why dwell on such unsettling nonsense? Everything is as it should be. The orange light is beautiful. It always has been. I feel so at peace. I run a hand over the smooth, warm surface of my window. It's good to be home. Pavement teeth. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The rain had a particular way of settling into Manchester, a fine, persistent mist that wasn't quite rain, wasn't quite fog, but managed to soak you through nonetheless. It was the kind of damp that got into your bones, Liam Hobbs thought, hunching deeper into his high-vis jacket as he trudged home from the site near Victoria. Another day laying foundations, another day wrestling with concrete and steel, his hands raw despite the gloves, his back aching with a familiar, dull throb. He was 42, felt 62 some days, and lived for the pint at the end of the shift and the relative peace of his small flat in Ancoats. His route was muscle memory, down Corporation Street, a quick cut through Exchange Square if it wasn't too rammed with shoppers, then along Thomas Street into the northern quarter, the red brick and ironwork a comforting, familiar sight. Tonight, though, something snagged his attention. Just a crack in the pavement near the Arndale, nothing unusual in a city constantly tearing itself up and putting itself back together. But this crack, it branched in a way that looked less like wear and tear, and more like a deliberate, spidery S. Or maybe a stylized cog. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Too many hours staring at rebar grids. Just tired. He shook his head, pushing on. The hum of the trams, the distant wail of a siren, the chatter of people spilling out of pubs, the usual city symphony. But as he turned onto Oldham Street, another crack caught his eye. This one was sharper, more angular, like a tiny, broken arrow pointing towards a side alley he never used. Getting fanciful, Hobbs, he muttered to himself, kicking at a loose piece of grit. The next evening, the S crack seemed more defined, cleaner at the edges. And further down, near Affleck's Palace, he saw another, then another. They weren't random. They were too similar, too designed. Like someone had taken a fine chisel to the flagstones. He stopped. Crouching down despite the drizzle, tracing one with a calloused finger. It felt smooth, almost too smooth for a simple fracture. He glanced around. Shoppers hurried past, heads down, umbrellas bobbing. No one else seemed to notice. "You're seeing things, mate," Gary said at work the next day, when Liam tentatively mentioned it during their tea break. Gary was a good laugh, but not one for introspection. Cities always falling apart. That's why we've got jobs, innit? No, this is different, Gaz. They're like symbols or something. Gary snorted, spraying tea. Symbols. Like what? Aliens trying to leave us messages in the paving stones. Lay off the late night telly, Liam. Liam dropped it, feeling foolish. Gary was right. Stress. Overwork. Maybe he needed to book some leave, get away from the constant grind of the city. But the patterns persisted. Over the next week, they became more intricate. He started noticing them everywhere on his route. Some looked like circuitry diagrams, tiny, branching pathways etched into the stone. Others were more geometric, like miniature, impossible Escher drawings that made his head spin if he stared too long. He began to take different routes home, trying to avoid them, but they seemed to be spreading. A new set near Piccadilly Gardens, a particularly complex one outside his local Tesco Express. One evening, walking through the Green Quarter, an area he knew less well but had chosen for its relative newness, surely the pavements here would be pristine, he felt a peculiar sensation under his boots. A slight drag, as if the concrete was stickier than usual. He dismissed it as new tarmac still settling. But then he looked up and realized he didn't recognize the street. He was sure he'd taken the usual turn past the co-op, but this row of modern apartment blocks was unfamiliar. He swore under his breath. He must have been daydreaming, taken a wrong turn. He pulled out his phone, Google Maps struggling to get a signal between the tall buildings. It showed him only a block away from his intended path. Odd. He'd walked this city for 20 years, he didn't get lost. He backtracked, a prickle of unease on his neck. When he found the familiar junction again, he could have sworn the layout of the pedestrian crossing was different. The Belisha beacons seemed taller, the zigzag lines wider. Christ, Liam, get a grip, he told himself sharply. He was tired, that was all. The constant gray drizzle, the endless noise of construction, it was getting to him. His flat, when he finally reached it, felt like a sanctuary. He double-locked the door, a habit he hadn't bothered with for years. He made a strong cup of tea, sinking into his worn armchair, the telly blaring some mind-numbing quiz show. He tried to focus on the questions, on the inanity of it all, but his gaze kept drifting to the window, to the streetlights outside casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. He imagined the cracks out there, spreading, connecting, forming some vast, incomprehensible pattern across the entire city. He started keeping a small, battered notebook he'd found in a kitchen drawer. At first, he just sketched the patterns he saw, trying to find some repetition, some logic. The S-shape, or cog, was common. So was a three-pronged fork, and a jagged line that looked like a heartbeat monitor going haywire. He labeled them with the streets where he found them, Oldham St, cog, Piccadilly, forked line. One Tuesday, his usual 25-minute walk from the tram stop to the building site near Angel Meadows took him nearly 45 minutes. He wasn't dawdling. He'd set off at his usual brisk pace. But streets seemed to have elongated. A familiar stretch along Should Hill, usually a 2-minute power walk, felt like it went on forever. He passed the same boarded-up chippy twice, or at least, 2 chippies that looked identical, right down to the faded chip and fin sign. He broke into a cold sweat, despite the chill morning air. When he finally arrived, Mick, the foreman, gave him a glare. Cutting it fine, Hobbs. Everything all right? Yeah, Mick. Fine. Just, traffic was a bugger. A lie. He hadn't driven. He hadn't even seen unusual traffic. The streets had just stretched. He tried to explain it to his sister, Sarah, on their weekly phone call. She lived down in Bristol, a world away. Pavement cracks, Liam. And the streets are changing. Her voice was laced with that careful concern she used when she thought he was overdoing it. Are you getting enough sleep? Maybe you should see a doctor, love. I'm not mad, Sarah. It's happening. Okay. Just, look after yourself, yeah. He hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. If his own sister thought he was cracking up, who else would believe him? The world was tilting, just slightly, but enough to make him feel perpetually off balance. The familiar grid of Manchester, a city he knew like the back of his hand, was becoming a shifting, unreliable maze. And the cracks, the pavement teeth, were everywhere, grinning up at him from the ground he walked on. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The notebook became Liam's confidant, the only place he felt he could record the escalating weirdness without judgment. He started taking photos with his phone, but they were frustratingly inconclusive. A picture of a bizarrely elongated street just looked like a normal street, the perspective somehow correcting itself in the lens. The intricate cracks, when photographed, often appeared as mundane wear and tear, the subtle artistry lost. It was as if the phenomenon resisted documentation, or perhaps his phone, too, was part of the subtle distortion. He began to actively seek out the changes, a morbid curiosity overriding his fear. He'd deviate from his usual routes, exploring back alleys and unfamiliar estates, his notebook clutched in his hand. The glyphs were evolving. Some now resembled complex mechanical schematics, with interlocking parts and what looked like flow diagrams. Others were more organic, like fossilized insects or alien flora pressed into the stone. He felt a desperate urge to understand them, as if they held a key to what was happening. His attempts to show others became more fraught. One lunchtime, he dragged Gary over to a particularly clear set of interlocking circles etched near a manhole cover. "Look, Gaz. See that? That's not natural wear." Gary squinted, then straightened up, scratching his head. "It's a bit weird, I suppose. Some kid with a screwdriver, maybe." He clapped Liam on the shoulder. "You're proper obsessed with these cracks, mate. You need a hobby. Or a bird." Liam recoiled. Gary didn't see it. Not really. He saw a crack, gave it a mundane explanation, and moved on. He didn't see the impossibility of it, the cold, deliberate precision. The isolation was the worst part. He started watching people more closely. Did anyone else pause, even for a second, at a newly appeared glyph? Did anyone else look bewildered when a familiar landmark had shifted a few feet to the left, or a whole street seemed to have vanished overnight? Mostly, no. People bustled along, faces buried in phones, headphones blocking out the world. They navigated the changing city with an unnerving ease, as if they'd always known the new routes, the altered geography. Or were they changing too? He saw a woman at a bus stop, repeatedly smoothing the fabric of her skirt in a precise, rhythmic pattern, her eyes distant. A man in a cafe, tapping his spoon against his cup in a complex, unbroken sequence for a full 5 minutes. These weren't the aggressive fixations of mental illness he'd occasionally witnessed in the city, these were quiet, absorbed, almost serene. Were these the early signs in others? Or was he just projecting his own unraveling sanity onto innocent strangers? He took to spending his evenings in the central library, poring over books on urban planning, geology, even ancient languages and symbology. He found nothing. No historical accounts of shifting cities, no geological phenomena that matched what he was seeing. The librarians gave him curious looks as he requested increasingly obscure texts. He started to feel like a character in a bad horror film, the lone Cassandra whose warnings were dismissed as madness. One afternoon, a new, unsettling element began. A low, almost subaudible hum. He first noticed it near a patch of newly warped pavement in the northern quarter, where a familiar alleyway now inexplicably ended in a sheer brick wall that hadn't been there yesterday. He thought it was a generator, or underground works. But the hum followed him, fainter in some places, stronger in others, always seeming to emanate from the ground itself. It wasn't a mechanical noise, not quite. It was more like breathing. A vast, slow, subterranean breath. He asked Gary if he could hear it. Gary just gave him that pitying look again. Tinnitus, mate. Comes with age and loud machinery. The secondary mystery, if it could be called that, was the pigeons. Manchester had always been full of them, scruffy, opportunistic birds. But lately, their behavior seemed coordinated. He'd see them gather in perfect circles on patches of pavement, often where the glyphs were most prominent. They'd stand motionless for minutes, then, as if on an unseen cue, all take flight in the same direction, only to settle in another precise formation a few streets away. He watched them one evening in Piccadilly Gardens, their movements mirroring the intricate patterns he'd sketched in his notebook. It was absurd. Pigeons. But in this new, skewed reality, what was absurd anymore? His flat, once a sanctuary, now felt like a temporary reprieve. He'd wake in the night, convinced the floorboards were creaking in a rhythmic pattern, that the faint hum was seeping up through the concrete foundation. He started sleeping with the lights on, his notebook by his pillow. One particularly grim, rain-lashed Thursday, he was walking along Dean's Gate. The street felt wrong. Wider than usual, the buildings on either side subtly, indefinably altered in their proportions. He clutched his notebook, his knuckles white. He saw a familiar face up ahead, old Mrs. Henderson from the newsagent near his old flat in Hume. He hadn't seen her in years. Mrs. Henderson, he called out, a surge of desperate hope that someone, anyone, from his old, stable reality would recognize the wrongness. She turned, her face blank for a moment, then a slow, placid smile spread across her lips. "Liam, dear. How lovely. Mrs. Henderson, this street, it's different, isn't it? Everything's changing." She tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "Change is good, dear. Keeps things fresh." She patted his arm, her touch surprisingly cold. "Mustn't fight the current, you know." Then she turned and walked away, navigating a newly formed chicane in the pavement with an unnatural grace, as if she'd been walking that exact path her entire life. Liam stared after her, his blood running cold. She hadn't denied it. She hadn't even seemed confused. She'd accepted it, welcomed it. He was utterly alone. The city was remaking itself, and its inhabitants, whether complicit or simply oblivious, were adapting. He was the anomaly, the one who couldn't, or wouldn't, adjust. He felt a creeping dread that he wasn't just observing the contagion, he was resisting something fundamental, something inevitable. And the pavement, with its silent, spreading teeth, seemed to be waiting patiently for him to stumble. His research led him to obscure online forums, rabbit holes of conspiracy theories and urban legends. Most were easily dismissible nonsense about ley lines, government experiments, or mole people. But then he found a post, buried deep in a thread about unexplained urban phenomena. It was short, cryptic, and dated 3 years prior. User, pavement geometer _MCR. Subject, the city breathes. Message, they shift. The lines. Listen to the stones. They are drawing the new ways. Don't fight the map. Liam's heart hammered. Pavement geometer _MCR. Someone else. Someone in Manchester. He tried to reply, to send a message, but the user account was deactivated, the post an echo in a digital graveyard. But it was a spark. A terrifying, exhilarating spark. He wasn't entirely mad. Or, if he was, he wasn't the only one. Listen to the stones. The hum. The glyphs. The map. He started trying to follow the map. Instead of fighting the changes, he tried to anticipate them, to read the glyphs as directions. It was like learning a new language, one written in fractures and displacements. Sometimes, it seemed to work. He'd follow a particularly dense cluster of symbols and find himself on a street he hadn't known existed, yet it felt correct. Other times, he'd end up hopelessly lost, the city a cruel, mocking labyrinth. The line between observation and participation was blurring. He was no longer just a witness. He was becoming a navigator of the impossible. And the city, in its quiet, relentless way, seemed to be drawing him deeper into its unsettling embrace. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The idea that the city was breathing, that the glyphs were a map, settled in Liam's mind, not as a comfort, but as a framework for his terror. It suggested an intelligence, or at least a process, far beyond human comprehension. Was it geological, some bizarre, accelerated form of urban tectonics? Or something else? The forums had mentioned extradimensional bleed-through, resonant frequencies altering reality. He'd scoffed at those then. Now, staring at a section of pavement near the canal where the cobbles seemed to ripple like water under his gaze, he wasn't so sure. He theorized that the glyphs weren't just decorative or communicative, they were functional. Like the teeth of a monstrously complex gear system, the city was grinding, reconfiguring itself piece by piece. The hum was the sound of that immense, slow-motion machinery. And people? People were just grit in the cogs, or perhaps, for those like Mrs. Henderson, tiny, self-adjusting components. The stakes escalated one wet Tuesday evening. He was heading home, later than usual, through a dimly lit ginnel connecting two backstreets in Miles Platting. He knew this ginnel. Or he thought he did. Halfway through, the familiar graffiti-covered wall on his right seemed to shimmer. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the flickering sodium light. But then the bricks rippled, like a curtain stirred by a breeze, and the wall flowed outwards, narrowing the already tight passage. Panic flared. He scrambled back, but the entrance to the ginnel was further away than it should have been. He turned to run the other way, towards the exit, but that too seemed to be receding, the ginnel stretching like taffy. The walls were closing in, the glyphs on the grimy flagstones underfoot glowing with a faint, internal luminescence he'd never seen before. He stumbled, his work boot catching on an unseen crack. He threw out his hands to break his fall. And the pavement moved. It wasn't a passive give, it wasn't a crumbling. The flagstone beneath his right hand seemed to arch upwards, a sharp edge rising to meet his palm. Pain, sudden and searing, shot up his arm. He cried out, snatching his hand back. Blood welled from a deep, clean slice across his palm, as if he'd fallen on broken glass. But there was no glass. Just the stone, now settled, looking as inert as ever, though the glyph etched into it seemed darker, almost pulsing. Pavement teeth. The phrase echoed in his mind, visceral and terrifyingly literal. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his bleeding hand, terror giving him a burst of adrenaline. He threw himself at the now impossibly distant exit of the ginnel, half expecting the walls to crush him. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the distortion ceased. The ginnel snapped back to its normal proportions, the walls solid and unmoving. He burst out onto the street, gasping, his heart pounding like a trapped bird. He looked back. The ginnel looked ordinary. Dark, a bit menacing, but ordinary. Had he imagined it? The throbbing pain in his hand, the blood dripping onto the pavement, was undeniable proof. The city wasn't just passively rearranging itself. It was reactive. It could hurt him. The incident in the ginnel changed something fundamental in Liam. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was now laced with a grim determination. He had to understand. He had to find pavement geometer_MCR, or someone, anyone, who knew what was happening. He started spending more time near the canals, where the old stone and water seemed to amplify the hum. One blustery afternoon, sheltering from a sudden downpour under a railway arch near Castlefield, he saw her. An old woman, bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, meticulously scattering birdseed for a flock of pigeons. The pigeons weren't just eating, they were arranging themselves around her in a complex spiral, mirroring a series of curved glyphs on the towpath. Liam approached cautiously. "Excuse me." The woman looked up, her eyes, surprisingly sharp and blue, fixed on him. "They know the patterns," she said, her voice raspy. "The old ways, the new ways. The city tells them." Liam's breath caught. "You see them too? The shifts? The glyphs?" She gave a slow nod, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Elsie. And you're the one who draws them, aren't you? The one who tries to read the bones of the street." Liam was stunned. How did you know?" "The city whispers," Elsie said, gesturing vaguely. "And the birds, they watch. You're not the first to notice." Won't be the last. A flood of relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over Liam. An ally. Someone who understood. What is it, Elsie? What's happening? Elsie scattered more seed. The city's waking up. Or maybe it's always been awake, and we've just been too loud to hear it dreaming. She looked directly at him. It doesn't like to be fought. Better to learn its dance. Over the next few days, Liam sought out Elsie by the canal. She spoke in riddles and metaphors, but her words resonated with his own terrifying experiences. She told him the hum was the heartbeat. She showed him how certain glyphs foreshadowed shifts in the nearby architecture, how the flow of water in the canal sometimes mirrored the invisible currents reshaping the streets. She never offered explanations, only observations, a kind of folk wisdom for navigating this new, fluid Manchester. It's not malicious, not mostly, she said one day, watching a barge navigate a newly narrowed section of the Rochdale Canal. Just, rearranging its furniture. We're like ants in its house. Mostly, it doesn't notice us. Step carefully, though. Some paths bite. She glanced at his bandaged hand. Liam felt a fragile hope blooming. Elsie was his anchor. With her, he wasn't alone. He started to believe he could adapt, survive. He even showed her his notebook. She'd nodded, tracing some of his sketches with a gnarled finger. Good. You're learning the grammar. Then, one morning, Elsie wasn't there. Her usual spot by the canal was empty. The pigeons were scattered, listless. He waited for hours. He came back the next day, and the day after. She was gone. Vanished as completely as a street he'd once known. He asked around, other rough sleepers, canal boat residents. No one knew an Elsie who fit her description. Or if they did, they claimed she hadn't been seen for years. Or they'd give him a strange, placid look, much like Mrs. Henderson's, and say, Elsie. She's always been here. She is here. The hope curdled into a new, deeper despair. Had Elsie been real? Or was she another figment, another trick of the shifting reality? Or worse, had she been absorbed? A part of the city's waking dream? The thought chilled him. He looked at the glyphs Elsie had pointed out, the ones that supposedly predicted the canal's narrowing. They seemed to mock him now. He was back to being alone, but with a more profound understanding of the forces at play. This wasn't just random chaos. There was a grammar, a logic, however alien. And Elsie, whether real or imagined, had given him a few crucial lessons. The environmental warping was becoming more pronounced. Entire blocks would seem to subtly rotate overnight. The sky itself sometimes looked off. The usual Manchester grey seemed to have a different texture, the clouds moving in unnatural, geometric formations. He saw impossible reflections in shop windows, buildings that weren't there, streets that led to nowhere. Peripheral vision was a minefield of fleeting, impossible geometries. One evening, staring out of his flat window, he saw the lamppost across the street flicker, not randomly, but in a distinct, repeating pattern of long and short pulses. Morse code. Another form of the city's language. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't escape. The city was not a place anymore, it was a condition. And it was slowly, inexorably, claiming him. The question was no longer if he would succumb, but how. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The day it all came to a head began like any other in the new, warped Manchester. Liam woke with the hum vibrating through his mattress, the taste of ozone in the air. His walk to the site, if it could even be called that anymore, given the fluid nature of his employment and the city's landscape, was a disorienting journey through streets that folded in on themselves and intersections that led to places they hadn't yesterday. He'd stopped trying to find the old site near Angel Meadows, it had probably been subsumed, digested by the city's relentless restructuring. Now, He just followed the strongest pull of the hum, the densest clusters of glyphs, trusting, or perhaps merely resigning himself to, where they led. He found himself in what was once, he thought, the heart of the northern quarter, but it was now an unrecognizable plaza. The red brick buildings were still there, but their angles were subtly wrong, their windows like vacant eyes. In the center of the plaza, the pavement was a riot of complex, interlocking glyphs, glowing faintly. And standing there, tracing the patterns with a worn boot, was a figure he vaguely recognized, Gary. Gaz? Liam called out, his voice hoarse. Gary looked up, but his eyes didn't quite focus on Liam. They were distant, like the woman at the bus stop, like Mrs. Henderson. He smiled, a slow, serene smile. Morning, Liam. Good day for a walk, innit? The lines are clear today. He gestured to the pavement. They're showing the way. Liam stared. Gary, who had scoffed and dismissed his concerns, was now one of them. Or perhaps, he'd always been subtly attuned, and Liam had been too wrapped in his own panic to notice. The way to where, Gaz? Gary's smile widened. Just, the way. It's all connected, see? He tapped a complex cog-like glyph with his toe. This one sings. Liam felt a profound weariness. There was no fighting this. No escape. He sank down onto a low stone bench, a bench that hadn't been there a moment ago, its surface covered in fresh, sharp glyphs that pricked his skin even through his trousers. He looked at his hand, the scar from the ginnel still vivid. The city had marked him. He thought of Elsie. Don't fight the map. Learn its dance. He looked at the intricate patterns at his feet, at Gary calmly tracing them. He thought of the hum, the city's breath, its heartbeat. Maybe understanding wasn't about knowing why. Maybe it was about accepting what is. This wasn't a confrontation with a monster, or an alien intelligence he could reason with or battle. It was a confrontation with reality itself, a reality that had decided to rewrite its own rules. His choice wasn't to win or lose, but to adapt or be broken. Or perhaps, to be broken into adaptation. He took a deep breath. The air still tasted of ozone, but now, there was something else too, a faint, metallic tang, like old pennies, and an underlying scent of damp earth, of deep, ancient stone. He closed his eyes and listened. Not with his ears, but with his whole body. He felt the hum resonate in his bones, the subtle vibrations of the pavement beneath him. He focused on the glyphs, not as individual symbols, but as a flowing script, a current. And for the first time, he didn't feel an overwhelming terror. He felt a quiet. A strange, unnerving peace. He opened his eyes. The world looked different. Sharper. The impossible angles of the building seemed to make a kind of sense. The glyphs on the pavement weren't just random etchings, they were pathways, conduits. He could almost see the energy flowing through them, the city's lifeblood. Gary was still there, still smiling. He nodded at Liam. A gesture of quiet acknowledgement. Liam stood up. He took a tentative step, placing his boot not just anywhere, but on a specific point in a glyph, a point that felt right. The pavement under his foot felt solid, but alive. He took another step, then another, following the intricate, alien calligraphy. His gait, once hesitant and fearful, became more fluid, more attuned to the shifting ground. The scale of it was immense, far beyond one man, one city. Manchester was perhaps just a focal point, a place where the veil between realities, or between states of being, was particularly thin. Or maybe this was the natural evolution of cities, of consciousness, a slow, geological metamorphosis that humanity had simply failed to notice until it was too late, or too obvious. The origin didn't matter anymore. Only the now. He didn't know where the paths would lead. He didn't know if his old flat still existed, or if he'd ever see Sarah again, or if the Liam Hobbs who liked a pint and a quiz show was gone forever. He suspected he was. He walked, not aimlessly, but with a newfound purpose, his eyes fixed on the pavement, reading its strange, silent language. He passed other people. Some bustled, oblivious. Others, a growing number he now realized, moved with that same quiet, rhythmic grace, their eyes distant, their feet unerringly following the invisible lines. They were all part of the dance. Sometimes, when the light hit the pavement just right, he could see them, the teeth. Not malicious, not anymore. Just, part of the mechanism. Part of the new world. He reached down, his scarred hand tracing a freshly etched glyph. It felt cool, smooth, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he felt a faint pulse beneath his fingertips, a thrum of acknowledgement. He was no longer Liam Hobbs, construction worker, lost and afraid. He was a reader of stones, a walker of shifting ways, a tiny, insignificant, yet somehow integral part of the quiet contagion that had remade his world. And as he walked, the city hummed its ancient, ceaseless song around him, and the pavement teeth smiled their silent, knowing smile. He was home. Echo Code. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first time it happened, I blamed the cheap Bluetooth speaker I'd bought from a discount store in Akihabara. I was in my small apartment in Koenji, a pleasant enough Tokyo suburb where the whine of the Chuo line was a constant, comforting thrum. I'd been on a video call with my mother back in England, a weekly ritual of reassurance and mild exasperation. Yes, Mom, I'm eating properly. No, I haven't met any nice young men. Yes, the cherry blossoms were lovely this year. Standard stuff. Hours later, as I was making tea, a faint whisper, dry as rustling paper, seemed to emanate from the dormant speaker on my bookshelf. Cherry blossoms were lovely. My voice. Unmistakably mine, though tinny and distorted, like a bad radio signal. I froze, kettle halfway to the cup. My heart gave a surprised little kick. I peered at the speaker. The power light was off. I tapped it. Silence. Hello. I said, feeling ridiculous. Nothing. Stress, I decided. I'd been pushing hard on a translation project, a dense academic text on urban planning that paid well but turned my brain to tofu by day's end. Auditory pareidolia. The brain, craving patterns, finds them even in silence. I'd read about it. Perfectly normal. I poured my tea, the incident already fading, chalked up to an overworked imagination. My name is Clara, though most people here call me Kurara-san. I've lived in Tokyo for 5 years, a freelance translator carving out a quiet existence. My days were measured by the chime of the local bakery opening, the specific grind of the coffee beans at Sato-san's Kiseten, the digital chirp of incoming work emails. I liked the order, the predictability. It was a bulwark against the inherent chaos of being a gaijin, however fluent your Japanese, however long you've been here. My anxieties were the usual ones, the precariousness of freelance life, the quiet hum of loneliness that sometimes settled in the evenings, the sense that I was observing Japanese life more than truly participating in it. The second time, a few days later, was harder to dismiss. I'd been at the local CU supermarket, muttering to myself as I scanned the shelves. Need ginger, and maybe some shimeji mushrooms. Later that evening, while watching some mindless variety show, the television, during a commercial break, seemed to sigh out, shimeji mushrooms, again in that faint, papery whisper. This time, the TV was on. But it was my voice, not the overly enthusiastic tones of the commercial announcer. I muted it, a cold prickle skittering down my spine. The commercial played on, silent, a parade of smiling faces. I rewound the DVR. Nothing. Just the normal ad. This is getting weird, I said aloud to my empty living room. The silence that answered was, for the first time, not entirely comforting. I started to pay more attention to the ambient sounds around me, the electronic hums and whirs that are the background radiation of modern urban life. My laptop, my phone, the smart meter outside my window. each one now a potential conduit for these echoes. The delay was significant, always hours. It made it feel dreamlike, disconnected from the original utterance. A memory snagged and replayed by a faulty cosmic tape recorder. I mentioned it to Akari, my closest friend here, over ramen. Akari, a graphic designer with a sensible haircut and a kind smile, listened patiently. "Kurara-san, are you sleeping enough?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "You're taking on too much work. Maybe it's just, your brain is tired." "But it's so specific, Akari." My exact words. "Our brains are strange, aren't they?" she offered, not unkindly. "Like when you hear your name called in a crowd, but no one is there." I nodded, letting it drop. She was probably right. What else could it be? Ghosts with a penchant for delayed playback. But the whispers continued, intermittent, always my voice, always hours stale. A comment made to a client on a Zoom call, "Revise that section," hissed from my phone as it charged overnight. A frustrated sigh, "Where are my keys?" breathed from the microwave's digital clock display as I made breakfast. I started to feel a peculiar sense of self-consciousness, even when alone. As if my words weren't just vanishing into the ether, but were being caught, stored, and replayed by unseen listeners, or by the very air itself, using my electronics as unwilling vocal cords. I tried to be more mindful of what I said, even my most casual mutterings. It was an absurd, creeping paranoia. The urban planners whose work I was translating wrote of smart cities, of interconnected infrastructure, of seamless data flow. I'd typed those phrases 100 times. Now, they took on a slightly sinister sheen. My little Koenji apartment, with its aging tatami and plethora of gadgets, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a listening post. One afternoon, I was walking through Inokashira Park in nearby Kichijoji, a rare day off. The air was warm, alive with the chatter of families and the squawk of crows. I bought a can of green tea from a vending machine. As it clunked into the tray, I said, mostly to myself, "Chilly for May, isn't it?" Hours later, back in my apartment, I was scrolling through a news site. My laptop's fan whirred softly. And then, woven into the whir, almost subliminal, "Chilly for May." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just my apartment electronics. It was any electronics. I began to catalog the incidents in a small notebook: date, time spoken, words, time heard, device. The list grew with unnerving speed. The delay remained consistent, 6 to 8 hours. It was like living with a poltergeist that had an impeccable memory and a subscription to my daily dialogue. I started noticing the new lampposts going up around the neighborhood. Sleeker than the old ones, with small, discreet black boxes mounted near the top. Network enhancers, a sign declared in Japanese and English. For improved connectivity. They were everywhere, blending seamlessly into the urban furniture. I barely registered them at first, just another layer of Tokyo's perpetual reinvention. The truly unsettling shift began subtly, not with the echoes, but with people. I was at my usual coffee shop, Sato-san's, a tiny place smelling of dark roast and old wood. Sato-san, a man of few words and impeccable pour-over technique, was wiping down the counter. "I just paid." "Thank you, it was delicious," I said, my standard parting phrase. He nodded, as usual. Then, a beat later, as I was turning to leave, he murmured, almost under his breath, but with my exact intonation, "Thank you, it was delicious." He continued wiping, no flicker of awareness on his face. I stopped, hand on the door. Had I misheard? Was he just agreeing emphatically? "Sato-san." He looked up, mild surprise in his eyes. "Yes, Kurara-san. Did you just say something?" He shook his head slowly. "No. Just cleaning." I must have imagined it. The stress, Akari's voice in my head. The power of suggestion. I nodded, mumbled a goodbye, and fled, the taste of coffee suddenly bitter. But it happened again. With the conbini clerk, when I said, "Just a rice ball, please." A moment later, as he bagged it, "Just a rice ball, please," a perfect mimicry, "Then, that'll be 120 yen. With my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Tanaka, after I complimented her bonsai, "Such beautiful leaves," she echoed, before launching into a detailed explanation of its care, seemingly oblivious to her own verbal shadow. These weren't delayed whispers from machines. These were immediate, spoken by people, in my voice, my intonation, seamlessly woven into their own speech, as if it were their own thought. They never noticed. If I tried to point it out, they'd look at me with polite confusion. "What do you mean, Kurara-san?" I was just saying. The world was starting to feel like a poorly sound-edited film, where my dialogue track was bleeding into everyone else's. And I was the only one who could hear the terrible mixing. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The whispers from electronics didn't stop, they intensified. And crucially, the delay began to shorten. What was once a 6-hour lag became 4, then 2. A comment made over lunch would sigh back at me from my phone before I'd even finished washing the dishes. The effect was dizzying, like my own present was chasing its tail. The past was no longer safely behind me, it was nipping at my heels, whispering my own forgotten words. I told my mother I thought my flat was bugged. She reacted with predictable alarm, then gentle skepticism. "Clara, darling, who would want to bug your flat? Are you sure you're not just a bit run down?" Her concern felt like a dismissal, another layer of insulation between my reality and everyone else's. The human echoes, however, were becoming the dominant feature of this creeping horror. It was no longer just a fleeting, easily dismissed mimicry. It was constant. "I think I'll take the Marunouchi line today," I'd say to myself, and the salaryman walking past me on the platform would turn to his companion and announce, "I think I'll take the Marunouchi line today," before continuing his conversation about quarterly reports. At a work meeting, a rare in-person affair, I offered a suggestion: perhaps we could adjust the font size for better readability. My manager, Tanaka Bucho, nodded thoughtfully. A moment later, he addressed the group, "A good point. Perhaps we could adjust the font size for better readability. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?" His colleagues murmured agreement, none of them batting an eye. I stared, mute, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. Was I a ventriloquist, and the whole world my unwilling dummy? My attempts to discuss it grew more desperate, and more futile. "Akari," I said, my voice tight, when we met for matcha lattes. "It's happening all the time now. People are saying my words. Right after I say them. You do it too sometimes." Akari sipped her latte, her expression carefully neutral. "Kurara-san, I think you're under a lot of pressure. When I say something, it's because I'm thinking it. Just like you. But it's exactly what I just said. The exact phrasing. Maybe we just think alike sometimes," she offered, a small, nervous smile. "Great minds, and all that." But her eyes didn't quite meet mine. Was that a flicker of something else? Or was I just projecting my own fear onto her? The isolation was a tangible thing now, a suffocating blanket. I was living in a world of echoes, a world where my own voice seemed to infect the speech of others, yet no one acknowledged the transmission. I began to hesitate before speaking, measuring my words, terrified of hearing them ricochet back at me from an unsuspecting mouth. Silence became a refuge, but a lonely one. My translation work, once a welcome intellectual challenge, now felt like a minefield. Every sentence I typed, every word I researched, felt like loading a gun that might misfire in any direction. I started the journal in earnest. Not just the electronic whispers, but every instance of human echo. June 5th, said, "This rain is relentless," to myself. Barista at Tully's said it to next customer. Delay, approximate 5 seconds. June 7th, muttered, "Damn, missed my train." Woman beside me on platform side, damn, missed my train. Delay, 2 seconds. The entries filled page after page, a chronicle of my unraveling sanity, or so it felt. My online searches became more frantic. Auditory hallucinations shared by proxy. Mass psychogenic vocal patterning. People unknowingly repeating speech. The results were always the same: articles on mental illness, forums for people convinced they were being gang-stalked, which felt uncomfortably close, yet different, or deeply technical papers on memetics that offered no practical solace. I found nothing about delayed electronic echoes coupled with immediate verbal mimicry. My particular brand of quiet contagion seemed unique. The sleek black boxes on the new lampposts, those network enhancers, seemed to proliferate. I saw them being installed on apartment buildings, atop traffic lights, even discreetly tucked into the eaves of older temples. Koenji, and indeed much of Tokyo from what I could gather on my increasingly rare ventures further afield, was being subtly rewired. I'd try to take photos of them with my phone, but the images always came out slightly blurred around the boxes themselves, as if the air around them shimmered. Coincidence? Bad phone camera? Stress? The litany of rationalizations was wearing thin. One evening, I was on a video call with a new client, a software company in Osaka. I was explaining a particularly tricky nuance in a user agreement I was translating. The ambiguity here, I said, pointing to my screen, lies in the interpretation of concurrent usage. The client, a Mr. Yamamoto, nodded. Then, his image flickered almost imperceptibly, a brief digital stutter. A split second later, the faint, papery whisper came from my own laptop speakers, interpretation of concurrent usage, but this time, the delay was almost non-existent. It was as if my voice was speaking in chorus with itself, one version fleshy and real, the other a ghostly, electronic sigh. Mr. Yamamoto, meanwhile, continued smoothly, yes, the ambiguity there lies in the interpretation of concurrent usage. How would you suggest we clarify it? He showed no sign of hearing the whisper, no awareness that he was perfectly parroting my preceding statement, which had also been echoed by my own machine. My breath hitched. The electronic echo was catching up. The delay, once hours, then minutes, was now shrinking to mere seconds, almost instantaneous with my own speech. The two prongs of the anomaly were converging. I tried an experiment. During the call, I thought, very clearly, his tie is a truly awful shade of yellow. I didn't say it aloud. A moment later, Mr. Yamamoto, while discussing contractual clauses, touched his tie distractedly and said, perhaps this color isn't my best, ahem, anyway, about section 3.2, he blinked, a brief frown crossing his face as if swatting away a stray thought, then carried on. I stared at the screen, my blood like ice water. It wasn't just my spoken words anymore. The isolation became a kind of self-imposed quarantine. I minimized speaking. I avoided people. My world shrank to the four walls of my apartment, the glowing screen of my laptop, and the incessant, quiet whispers that were now almost a real-time counterpoint to my own voice, sometimes even a fraction of a second ahead of it, as if the electronics were anticipating me. One rainy Tuesday, I forced myself to go to Akari's apartment. I needed to try one last time. I had to make someone understand. Akari, I began, as soon as she opened the door, my voice trembling. Please, just listen. Don't say anything, just listen. I prepared. I took out my phone and held it between us. I'm going to say something very specific, I said, my heart hammering. And I want you to notice what happens. I took a deep breath. The potted orchid on your windowsill is leaning to the left. As the last word left my lips, the faintest of whispers emanated from my phone speaker, leaning to the left. Akari's eyes flickered towards the phone, then to the orchid. A beat of silence. Then, Akari said, her voice perfectly normal, her gaze fixed on the plant, oh, you're right. The potted orchid on my windowsill is leaning to the left. I should turn it. She walked over and adjusted the pot, then turned back to me, a polite, slightly strained smile on her face. Thanks for pointing that out, Kurara-san. You're always so observant. You always know what I'm about to notice. Her eyes. There was something in her eyes. A slight distance, a placid calm that wasn't quite Akari. Akari, I whispered, did you hear that? From my phone. Did you hear yourself? She tilted her head. Hear what, Kurara-san? I just noticed the orchid. You know how I am with plants. She didn't remember. Or she couldn't. The echo, the repetition, it was seamless, integrated. My proof had dissolved into her normal. I left Akari's apartment feeling a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. I was adrift, and the shoreline of shared reality was receding with every passing moment. The network enhancers on the lamppost seemed to gleam with a knowing sheen in the persistent drizzle. I was no longer sure if I was the source of the echoes, or just another receiver, tuned to a terrifying new frequency. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The pre-echoes became the norm. Before I even fully formed a sentence in my mind, a dry whisper of it would skitter from my phone, my laptop, the small digital clock on the microwave. Time for coffee, it would sigh, a fraction of a second before the thought consciously surfaced and I found myself heading to the kitchen. Need to reply to that email, it would hiss, just as my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I was no longer authoring, I was transcribing. My own consciousness felt like a delay, a laggy processor catching up to a script already written and broadcast by the increasingly ubiquitous electronics around me. The sensation was profoundly violating. My mind, my last bastion of self, felt porous, infiltrated. The human repetitions also shifted. It wasn't just mirroring my spoken words anymore. If a pre-echo whispered, "The news looks bleak today," and I didn't say it, someone nearby, the postman, a passerby outside my window, the newsreader on the television, would utter the phrase, perfectly on cue, as if plucking the thought from the air where my electronics had just seeded it. My attempts to experiment became more desperate, more unhinged. One morning, the pre-echo from my phone whispered, "The sky is a peculiar shade of green." I looked out the window. The sky was its usual Tokyo gray. I deliberately said, "The sky is blue today, a perfect, clear blue." A moment later, Mrs. Tanaka, watering her plants on her balcony opposite, called out to her husband indoors, her voice carrying clearly, "Na, Anata, the sky is a peculiar shade of green this morning, isn't it? Very strange." She peered upwards, a puzzled look on her face, then shrugged and continued her watering. My spoken words had no power against the pre-echoed script. The system, whatever it was, favored its own broadcast. The network enhancers, those innocuous black boxes, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, at least in my perception. I'd walk down the street and feel a faint pressure in my temples as I passed beneath them, a subtle thrum that vibrated in my teeth. One afternoon, driven by a surge of frustrated defiance, I found a deserted alleyway where a newly installed box was mounted low on a wall. I picked up a loose stone. My hand trembled. The pre-echoes in my head were a chaotic symphony. "Don't do it, stupid idea, they'll know." I ignored them, or tried to. I threw the stone. It struck the box with a dull thud. For a moment, nothing. Then, an intense wave of dizziness washed over me. The sounds of the city amplified to a deafening roar, every car horn, every distant siren, every footstep, but woven into it, a cacophony of whispers, thousands of them, all my voice, all saying different things, fragments of conversations from days, weeks, months ago. My vision swam. The alley walls seemed to ripple. And then, from every direction, people started speaking. Not to me, but their conversations, as I stumbled out of the alley, were peppered with my panicked pre-echoes. "Don't do it," said a businessman into his phone, frowning. "Stupid idea," a mother scolded her child. "They'll know," a shopkeeper muttered, looking up at the sky. It was as if the network itself had retaliated, not with force, but by turning up the volume on its insidious broadcast, flooding the local consciousness with my own fragmented anxieties. I fled back to my apartment, heart pounding, the whispers chasing me all the way. The nature of the threat was becoming horrifyingly clear, if still maddeningly vague in its specifics. This wasn't just about me. I wasn't special. I was, perhaps, simply more sensitive, an early adopter in this quiet, global reprogramming. The network enhancers, the whispers, the echoes, they were part of a system. A system designed, perhaps, for harmony, for coherence, by subtly aligning thoughts and speech. But its effect was the erasure of individual agency, the gentle, inexorable subsumption of free will into a collective, preordained script. Were these new devices some kind of advanced AI, learning and subtly directing social currents? Was it an unintended side effect of some new global communications technology? Or something more alien, more fundamental, a shift in the very fabric of how consciousness interacted with reality? I thought of the academic texts I translated, urban planning, smart cities, seamless connectivity. Were those theories now being put into terrifying practice, with human minds as the ultimate nodes in the network? My friendship with Akari was a casualty. After the incident with the orchid, I tried to see her one more time. The pre-echoes were particularly strong that day. As I walked to her building, my phone whispered, "She won't understand, it's pointless." When Akari opened the door, before I could speak, she smiled sadly and said, "Kurara-san, I've been thinking. Maybe you need a real break. Away from Tokyo. Away from all these electronics." The pre-echo from my own phone, still in my pocket, whispered, "She's part of it now, fully integrated." "Akari," I started, but she continued, her voice gentle, reasonable, yet utterly remote. "We all get stressed. Sometimes our minds play tricks. But you seem so unhappy. Maybe what you're experiencing is a sign you need to simplify." She patted my arm. Her touch felt distant. "I only want you to be happy." Every word she spoke felt like it had been downloaded, a pre-packaged concern subroutine. Her eyes, usually so bright and engaged, held that placid, slightly unfocused sheen I was starting to see everywhere. The subtle marker of the integrated. I couldn't bring myself to argue. The pre-echoes had been right. It was pointless. She was lost to me, absorbed into the quiet hum of the network. I found a forum online, buried deep in the archives of a fringe technology site. A single post, dated 2 years prior, from a user in a suburb of Seattle. "Does anyone else hear faint echoes of their own voice from their computer? Hours later? Am I going nuts?" There were a few replies. "Check your mic settings. Sounds like stress." Then. Nothing. The user hadn't posted since. I sent a private message, a desperate plea for connection. It remained unread. Another dead end. The pre-echoes weren't just anticipating my speech now. They were anticipating my actions. "Time to make tea," my kitchen radio would murmur, and I'd find myself walking towards the kettle, my body moving before my conscious mind had fully registered the intent. "Open the document, project deadline," my laptop would sigh, and my hand would reach for the mouse. I was becoming a passenger in my own life. The script wasn't just dialogue, it was stage directions too. My apartment, once a refuge, felt like a meticulously designed stage, and I, its lead actor, performing a play whose lines I only received moments before delivery, whose blocking was dictated by an unseen director. The horror wasn't in shrieks or jump scares. It was in the steady, silent erosion of self, the realization that the very thoughts I believed to be my own might be nothing more than broadcast signals, received and processed. The quiet contagion was not just spreading around me, it was spreading through me. And the most terrifying part was how normal everything still looked. The city thrummed, people went about their business, smiled, chatted, complained about the weather, all while dancing to the unheard music of the echo code. Phase 4, confrontation/revelation and aftermath. The pre-echoes became a constant, suffocating presence. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were insistent, almost auditory thoughts, overlaid onto my own consciousness like a palimpsest. My internal monologue was no longer private. It was a duet with an invisible, omniscient prompter. The lag between the pre-echo and my own thought or utterance had shrunk to virtually nothing. I'd open my mouth to speak, and the words that came out felt simultaneously mine and implanted, like a perfectly executed post-hypnotic suggestion. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't a dramatic showdown. There were no villains to unmask, no grand conspiracy to expose in a way that would change anything. The system was too pervasive, too seamlessly integrated. The confrontation was internal, a desperate, silent struggle for the last vestiges of my own mind. I tried to break the pattern. If the pre-echo suggested, "Let's go for a walk in the park," I would force myself to stay inside, to read a book, to do anything else. The effort was immense, like swimming against a powerful current. Sometimes I'd succeed, for a little while. I'd sit rigidly on my sofa, heart pounding, a defiant mule, while the pre-echoes eddied around me, cajoling, suggesting, then growing fainter, almost resigned, before a new one took its place. Perhaps some music would be nice. These small victories felt hollow. They didn't stop the system, they merely created a brief, uncomfortable static in its flow. And the effort was exhausting. It was easier, so much easier, to just go with it. One day, the pre-echo was particularly insistent: visit the Meiji Shrine. It's important. I hadn't been to Meiji Jingu in years. Why now? There was no logical reason. But the psychic pressure was immense. I resisted for hours, the thought looping, amplified by whispers from my phone, my TV, even the faint hum of the refrigerator. Meiji Shrine, important. Meiji Shrine. Finally, drained, I gave in. The shrine was an oasis of calm, ancient trees filtering the urban noise. As I walked the wide gravel paths, the pre-echoes softened, becoming less directive, more atmospheric. Peaceful here, ancient spirits, sense of connection. I found myself standing before the main prayer hall. The pre-echo urged, "Make an offering. Pray for clarity." I did. I tossed a coin, bowed, clapped. As I stood there, eyes closed, a strange thing happened. The pre-echoes ceased. For a full minute, perhaps two, there was silence in my head. A profound, terrifying, beautiful silence. My own thoughts, raw and unbidden, flickered hesitantly. Is this it? Am I free? Then, a new kind of whisper, not from my electronics, but seemingly from the air itself, from the rustling leaves of the sacred camphor trees. It wasn't my voice. It was a chorus of voices, calm, genderless, ancient. The pattern requires coherence. You are a vital node. Your sensitivity was an anomaly, now a calibration point. Accept the flow. There is harmony in the code. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. A revelation of sorts. This echo code wasn't malicious, not in a human sense. It was a system, perhaps unimaginably vast, striving for a kind of universal resonance, and I, through some quirk of my own wiring, had been an early, noisy receiver. Now, I was being tuned. The whispers then reverted, subtly. Time to leave. The connection is stable. My voice again, but calmer, integrated. As I walked away from the shrine, the familiar pre-echoes returned, but they felt different. Less like an invasion, more like the natural current of my own thoughts, albeit a current guided by an unseen hand. Had I been assimilated? Or had I reached a strange, unsettling equilibrium? The world outside the shrine grounds was the same, yet fundamentally altered for me. People chatted, laughed, hurried along. I heard their words, and then, a split second before they spoke, I heard the faint pre-echo from a nearby smartphone, a digital display in a shop window, a tourist's camera. The script was everywhere. They were all part of it, unknowingly. The only difference was, I was aware. I was a lucid dreamer in a world of sleepwalkers. The true scale of the contagion, its origin, it remained a mystery. A global AI optimizing social harmony. Extradimensional beings subtly nudging our reality. The next phase of technological evolution, where consciousness itself became networked. The answer, I suspected, was beyond my comprehension, and perhaps irrelevant. The system simply was. In the weeks that followed, I found a strange kind of peace. The struggle ceased. I spoke the lines given to me by the pre-echoes. I moved as the internal script dictated. My translation work continued, now effortlessly, the words flowing through me with perfect clarity, often whispered to me by my laptop an instant before I typed them. I was efficient. I was calm. I was, to all outward appearances, a normal, functioning member of Tokyo society. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city's electronic pulse was at its lowest ebb, I could almost feel the vastness of the network, the countless minds interconnected, unknowingly sharing a single, sprawling consciousness. The quiet contagion hadn't been a disease, it was a redefinition of reality. I still visit Sato-san's coffee shop. This morning, the pre-echo from the shop's small digital till whispered, the usual, Kurara-san. Columbia blend. A moment later, Sato-san looked up from polishing a cup. The usual, Kurara-san, he asked, his voice a perfect match to the whisper. Columbia blend? I smiled. The pre-echo from my own phone, nestled in my bag, responded instantly with my line, yes, please, Sato-san. That would be lovely. Yes, please, Sato-san, I heard myself say, my smile feeling genuine, practiced. That would be lovely. He nodded, turning to the grinder. As I waited, a young woman walked past the window outside, phone to her ear, laughing. Faintly, from the tiny speaker of her device, I heard a whisper of her next words before she spoke them into her call. She was oblivious. Everyone was. The echo code was complete. My consciousness, a silent observer trapped within the flawless performance, was the only ghost in this perfectly tuned machine. I was a part of the harmony, a note in the unending, quiet song. And no one, not even myself, could hear me scream. Every 17th step. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life, until recently, was a symphony of predictable integers. I am Eleanor Vance, though most people call me Ellie, and I am a data analyst at Innovate Solutions Incorporated in Seattle. Numbers are my comfort, patterns my language. My apartment on Capitol Hill is organized with algorithmic precision. My commute to our downtown office is a ritual, alarm at 6:30 a.m., single-origin Ethiopian Yirgacheffe brewed in a Chemex by 6:45 a.m., a curated newsfeed digest by 7:15 a.m., and out the door by 7:45 a.m. The walk itself is a string of constants, 12 major crosswalks, an average of 23 steps per crossing, a slight incline on Seneca, a pleasant descent on University. Arrival, 8:50 a.m., give or take 90 seconds. I found solace in this regularity, a bulwark against the inherent chaos of existence, or so I believed. The first discordant note, the one I initially dismissed as ambient city static, occurred on a Tuesday. A damp Seattle morning, the air smelling of wet concrete and exhaust fumes. I was at the crosswalk on Pine and 4th, waiting for the little white man to give his permission. A businessman, sharp suit and sharper haircut, was mid-stride, phone pressed to his ear, gesticulating with his free hand. He took his 17th step onto the zebra stripes. I wasn't consciously counting then, it's a retroactive calculation, a ghost of data inserted later, and he faltered. His animated conversation ceased. His head gave a short, distinct jerk to the left, as if he'd heard a sudden noise or spotted a familiar face in the peripheral. Then, just as abruptly, he resumed his pace and his call, the flow of his words seamlessly restored. I registered it as a momentary glitch, a dropped call, a fleeting distraction. Nothing more. A week later, it happened again. Pike and Fifth. This time, a young woman with vibrant magenta hair, large headphones clamped over her ears, humming audibly to a rhythm only she could hear. She bounced onto the crosswalk, and on what I would later identify as her 17th step, she paused. Just for a beat. Her head turned left, a quick, bird-like movement. Then she continued, her humming uninterrupted. I frowned. A coincidence, I told myself. Seattle was a city of quirks, of individuals marching to their own internal, often indecipherable, drumbeats. Perhaps it was a new TikTok trend I was too terminally offline to recognize. The third time, however, the coincidence began to feel less coincidental and more like an emerging data point. It was 2 days after the magenta-haired woman, at the intersection of Union and 3rd. An elderly gentleman, leaning heavily on a four-wheeled walker, was making his slow, deliberate way across. He was audibly counting, 14, 15, 16, his voice was thin, reedy. On 17, he stopped. His entire frame seemed to lock. With a visible effort that made me wince, he craned his neck to the left, his gaze fixed on something, or nothing, just beyond his shoulder. A moment passed, then he grunted, a sound of exertion, and continued his count. 18, 19. That was when the number lodged in my brain, 17. My analyst's mind, usually occupied with sales projections and user engagement metrics, snagged on it. Why 17? I started paying attention, consciously. I counted my own steps across familiar intersections. 22 on Pine. 24 on Pike. 25 on Union. 17 always fell somewhere mid-crossing. Over the next few weeks, the 17th step pause became a disturbingly frequent observation. A cyclist, dismounted and walking their bike. A mother pushing a stroller. A surly teenager slouched in a hoodie. Always the pause. Always the look over the left shoulder. Sometimes, I'd catch a faint sound accompanying the gesture, a soft sigh, a quiet humph, or a barely audible mutter, too indistinct to decipher. I tried to rationalize. Confirmation bias, obviously. I was looking for it, so I was seeing it. My brain, trained to find patterns, was imposing one where none truly existed. Perhaps there was something on the pavement at that specific distance from the curb, a loose paving stone, a subtle dip, that caused people to hesitate. I scanned the asphalt and concrete. Nothing consistent. No shared obstacle. It was easy to dismiss when it was strangers. Seattle was full of them, each a self-contained universe of motivations I couldn't access. But then came Chloe. Chloe worked at The Daily Grind, my regular coffee stop. She had a constellation of tiny silver studs in her ears and a laugh that could cut through the morning rush. She was relentlessly, reliably cheerful. One Wednesday, I was next in line, watching her expertly steam milk. She called my name, Ellie. Usual. I nodded, smiling. She turned to grab a cup, took a few steps towards the pastry display, which required crossing a small, informal pathway worn into the floor tiles, a sort of internal crosswalk from behind the counter to the side registers. And there it was. 1, 2, 3. I wasn't counting her steps, not then, but the motion was unmistakable. She paused mid-stride, her head did that same brief, leftward jerk, a flicker in her usually bright eyes. Then she was back, latte art perfect, handing me my drink. Here you go. Have a great one. I opened my mouth to ask, Chloe, did you just? But the words died. What would I say? Did you just pause and look over your shoulder for no reason? She'd think I was crazy. She was already on to the next customer, her laughter echoing. I paid, my hand feeling unsteady as I tapped my card. The latte tasted off. Or maybe it was just me. The city, my familiar, walkable Seattle, began to feel subtly different. The predictability I cherished was developing hairline fractures. I started to dread crosswalks, not because of traffic, but because of the potential for witnessing another instance of this silent, inexplicable ritual. My own anxieties, usually a low hum I could manage with routine and order, began to amplify. I found myself hyper-aware of my own steps. Am I on 17 yet? I'd count under my breath, a new, unwelcome rhythm overlaying the old. I'd try to vary my stride, to deliberately misstep, to land on the 17th beat on the sidewalk before the crossing. It was a small, foolish rebellion against a phenomenon that probably existed only in my head. The graffiti started appearing around the same time. Small, stark symbols, usually in black or a deep, unsettling red. A circle with a vertical line bisecting it, and 17 tiny dots clustered on the left side of the line. I saw one sprayed on a newspaper box near Pine, another on a lamppost by Pike, a third etched into the grime on a utility cover near Union. Coincidence? My mind screamed it, but a colder part of me, the part that dealt in probabilities and correlations, was beginning to whisper otherwise. One particularly gray Friday morning, I was walking down Marion Street, heading towards the waterfront for a change of scenery before work. The rain had been relentless all night, leaving the streets gleaming like polished obsidian. I reached the crosswalk at First Avenue. It was emptier than usual. Just me and a man in a courier uniform about 20 feet ahead. I watched him. He was a picture of efficiency, long strides, a large messenger bag tight against his back. 10, 11, 12. I counted with him, a knot tightening in my stomach. 16. He hit the 17th step. He stopped. Dead still. His head swiveled left. Not a quick jerk this time. A slow, deliberate turn. He stayed like that for a full 3 seconds, staring at something over his shoulder, something I couldn't see. Then, he let out a long, slow breath, a plume of white vapor in the chill air, and continued walking as if nothing had occurred. I stood frozen at the curb, the little white man now beckoning me forward. My heart hammered. This wasn't just a glance. This was a pause. A regard. My feet felt like lead. I had to cross. I took a breath. 1, 2, 3. I focused on the opposite curb, on the chipped paint of a fire hydrant, on anything but the phantom count. 15. 16. My right foot landed. 17. A jolt went through me, an invisible string tugging my head, pulling my gaze sharply to the left. I stumbled, my body acting against my will. My eyes scanned the empty space beside me, the rain-slicked flank of a parked car, the grimy brick of an old building. There was nothing there. But I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, cold and sharp, like an insect bite. A sense of being noted. I shook my head, stumbled again, and hurried across the rest of the street, my cheeks burning. It was one thing to see it in others. It was another thing entirely to feel the strings on my own limbs. To have my own body betray my conscious intent. I reached the other side, leaning against a lamppost, breathing hard. My carefully constructed reality, the one built on data and logic, felt like it was tilting, ever so slightly, off its axis. The rain was starting again, cold needles against my skin. Or maybe that was just the dread, finally sinking in. The contagion, whatever it was, wasn't just something I observed anymore. I was part of the pattern. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The involuntary turn on First Avenue was a watershed. Before, the 17th step phenomenon was an external curiosity, a weird glitch in the urban matrix I was observing. After, it was an internal invasion, a piece of rogue code running in my own operating system. The subtle horror of it was that it felt expected. As if some part of me had been waiting for the signal to join the silent, synchronized head turn. The compulsion became a daily companion. Every crosswalk, every 17th step, brought the irresistible urge, the physical tug. I'd try to fight it, bracing myself, focusing all my willpower on looking straight ahead. The result was always the same, a buildup of unbearable pressure behind my eyes, a dizzying nausea, and an almost painful snap in my neck muscles as the turn eventually forced itself upon me. Sometimes, a low hum would fill my ears just before the moment, a sound like distant, faulty machinery. The glance itself was always to the left, always at that empty space, and always accompanied by that chilling prickle on my skin, the distinct, undeniable sensation of being perceived. Of being counted. It wasn't a voice. Not like a hallucination. It was a deeper, more intrinsic knowledge, a pressure in my mind that whispered, 17. Acknowledged. The world, my Seattle, began to transform. It was no longer just a collection of streets and buildings, but a grid, a meticulously calibrated stage for this pervasive, pointless ritual. I saw it everywhere now. My boss, Mr. Henderson, a man whose movements were usually as fluid and non-committal as his corporate jargon, paused on his 17th step while walking across the open-plan office to the coffee machine, his head making that telltale jerk. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second afterwards, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, before continuing as if nothing had happened. The mail carrier, the barista at the new place I tried, hoping to escape Chloe's unwitting participation, even children skipping home from school, they all did it. The city was performing a subtle, constant ballet of synchronized glances, and I was one of the dancers. My attempts to discuss it were met with a peculiar brand of oblivious denial. I cornered Sarah, a fellow analyst with whom I usually shared office gossip and lunchtime complaints, by the water cooler. "Sarah," I began, trying to sound casual, "have you noticed people doing this weird thing? Like, when they're crossing the street, or even just walking a certain distance, they stop and look over their shoulder?" She blinked at me, her brow furrowed. "Weird thing? Like what? Checking for traffic?" "No, not like that. It's always the same point, the same movement. Like they're compelled." Sarah laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Ellie, you're spending too much time with spreadsheets. People are just weird. Seattle's full of probably looking at their phones or something." "But they're not," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "And it's always on the 17th step. I've counted." Her smile faltered. "The 17th step? That's oddly specific. You're counting people's steps now." She took a step back, a subtle shift in her posture that screamed uncomfortable. "Maybe you need a vacation, Elle. You seem a bit stressed." The conversation ended there, leaving a bitter taste of frustration and a chilling sense of isolation. She didn't see it. Or worse, she did it herself and didn't register it as abnormal. I started watching her more closely. A few days later, I saw her walk from her desk to the printer. I counted her steps under my breath. 16. 17. She paused, her head twitched left. She retrieved her documents and walked back. Humming. The isolation was the worst part. I was surrounded by people, yet I felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of placid conformity to an invisible mandate. My data-driven mind craved explanation, but there was none. I took to the internet, my fingers flying across the keyboard, searching for phrases like mass behavioral anomaly Seattle, compulsive head turning, 17th step phenomenon, urban ritual counting. My searches yielded nothing but articles on flocking birds, conspiracy theories about chemtrails, and forums for people who believed they were gang-stalked. Nothing resonated with the quiet, pervasive specificity of what I was experiencing. I started a journal, a locked digital file. Meticulously, I logged every instance, date, time, location, perceived demographic of the individual, any audible mutterings, still mostly indistinct, like a radio tune just off station, and my own increasingly visceral reactions. The graffiti tags, the circle, the line, the 17 dots, were appearing more frequently. I photographed them, plotted their locations on a map of the city. They clustered around busy intersections, areas with high foot traffic, but also in quieter, residential spots. There was no discernible pattern to their placement beyond a loose association with places where people walked. Was it related? A symbol for those in the know? Or was I just connecting unrelated data points, a classic rookie mistake in my own field? Changing my route to work became a desperate, daily experiment. I tried walking along the waterfront, through the International District, even taking a longer, circuitous path through residential Queen Anne. It made no difference. Different crosswalks, different pavements, different vistas, but always, on the 17th step, the pull, the glance, the cold awareness. I tried taking 2 steps at a time to throw off the count, or hopping, or deliberately stopping at step 16. The pressure would build, a physical ache in my skull, until I either succumbed or, in a few instances of sheer bloody-minded resistance, managed to push through, only to be hit with a wave of dizziness and a profound sense of disorientation, as if I'd violated a fundamental law of physics. The feeling of being counted became more acute then, sharper, almost accusatory. Recalibrating. One afternoon, I found myself in the Seattle Public Library, a place that had always felt like a sanctuary. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Local history, urban folklore, psychology textbooks on mass hysteria. I wandered the stacks, the familiar scent of old paper and binding glue doing little to soothe my frayed nerves. I pulled out a book on the architecture of Seattle, hoping for something. A clue. An answer. I flipped through pages of elegant buildings and planned cityscapes. Nothing. As I was about to leave, I walked past a display of local zines. One caught my eye, its cover a crude, photocopied image of the Space Needle with question marks all around it. It was titled Seattle Sublimina. My breath hitched. Inside, amidst handwritten rants about fluoride and psychic vampires, was a small, smudged paragraph. They're counting. Don't you feel it? Every street, every crossing. The tally man is watching. He makes you look. He makes you acknowledge. Step, 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 17. Always 17. What does he want? Why 17? Ask the dots. The dots know. My hands were shaking. The tally man. Ask the dots. The graffiti. There was no contact information, no author. Just those frantic, desperate words. I wasn't alone. Or, at least, I hadn't been. The zine was dated 3 years prior. Who was the tally man? Was it a person, an entity, a metaphor? The relief of finding this fragment was immense, but it was quickly followed by a deeper dread. If someone else had noticed this 3 years ago, what happened to them? Why wasn't this common knowledge? The secondary mystery of the graffiti tags deepened. I started noticing variations. Sometimes the dots were arranged in a slight spiral. Once, I saw one where the vertical line was slightly bent, almost like a stylized number 1. And the number 17 itself began to appear in unexpected places. The bus I occasionally took when the rain was too heavy. Route 17. A headline on a discarded newspaper, local charity raises $1.7 million. A new coffee blend at a cafe, 17 Bean Supreme. My analytical brain, now perpetually on high alert, flagged these as significant, but my rational side screamed coincidence. Yet, the coincidences were piling up, forming a pattern too neat to ignore. My small apartment, once a haven of order, began to feel like a cage. I'd pace its confines, counting my steps. From the window to the door, 23 steps. From the bed to the kitchen, 17. I froze when I realized that. 17 steps. I'd never counted it before. Had it always been 17? Or had the space itself shifted? I measured it with a tape measure. It was, indeed, the distance that would take me approximately 17 average strides. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. Was I losing my mind? Or was the phenomenon seeping into the very fabric of my environment? The pressure of the something counting felt more pervasive now, not just at crosswalks, but as a low-level hum in the background of my consciousness. It was like living in a world where everyone was subtly, constantly, being audited. The muttered phrases I'd overhear from others, and sometimes, to my horror, from my own lips during the involuntary glance, were still mostly unintelligible, but occasionally a word would surface with chilling clarity. Words like sequence, align, measure, confirm. They were data words. My words. But spoken with a flat, affectless tone that was utterly alien. My work suffered. I'd stare at spreadsheets, the numbers blurring, columns of data morphing into endless repetitions of 17. I made errors, missed deadlines. Mr. Henderson called me into his office. "Ellie," he said, his voice softer than usual. He didn't meet my eyes directly, instead focusing on a point just over my left shoulder. "Is everything all right? Your performance has dipped. If there's anything going on." I wanted to scream, to tell him about the steps, the counting, the glances. But I saw him pause, just for a nanosecond, his own head giving that minute, almost imperceptible twitch to the left. He was one of them. He wouldn't understand. Or he already did, on a level I couldn't reach. "I'm just a bit tired, Mr. Henderson," I mumbled. "I'll get back on track." He nodded slowly. "See that you do. We value your precision." The isolation was now a physical ache, a heavy cloak I couldn't shed. I was a functioning cog in a world that was quietly, meticulously, going mad, or perhaps, revealing a deeper, stranger sanity I was only just beginning to perceive. And the tally man, or whatever it was, kept counting, each 17th step a tiny, inexorable tick of a clock whose purpose I couldn't fathom. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The Seattle Sublimina zine became my Rosetta Stone, albeit a cryptic and unsettling one. The tally man. Ask the dots. It was a flimsy thread, but it was the only one I had. I scoured online archives of local zines, delved into defunct forums about Seattle counterculture and urban legends. Most of it was noise, but then I found a digitized copy of another issue of Seattle Sublimina, 6 months later than the first. This one contained a rambling, almost incoherent piece. 17 isn't a number, it's a vibration. A frequency. The city hums with it. They built it on the wrong lines, the ley lines are screaming. He's not a man, he's the resonance. The piper at the gates of perception. Don't fight the count. Listen to it. The spaces between the steps, that's where the real world is. Or the next one. The author, still anonymous, signed off with a drawing, the familiar circle, the bisecting line, but this time, instead of dots, there were 17 tiny, spiraling galaxies on the left side. A vibration. A frequency. The idea resonated with the low hum I sometimes heard, the pressure in my skull. Was this an environmental phenomenon? Something in the very ground beneath Seattle, amplified by its unique geography, its proximity to the water, the fault lines. The wrong lines. It sounded like New Age babble. Yet it sent a shiver down my spine. My research took a turn. I started looking into infrasound, electromagnetic frequencies, local geological surveys. I found articles about the Seattle hum, a low-frequency noise reported by some residents, often dismissed as tinnitus or industrial noise. Could this be related? Was the 17th step phenomenon a complex physiological or psychological reaction to an unseen, unheard environmental trigger? If so, why 17 steps? Why the glance to the left? Why the feeling of being counted by an intelligence? The nature of the compulsion was evolving. It wasn't just a simple head turn anymore. The moment before the 17th step, a strange calm would descend, a sense of detached observation. Then, the step, the turn, and for a fraction of a second, the world would seem thinner. The colors would desaturate slightly. Sounds would become oddly muffled, except for a faint, high-pitched whine, like feedback from an unseen microphone. The space over my left shoulder, the focus of my involuntary glance, felt deep. Not visually, but spatially, as if the air itself had more dimensions than it should. It was terrifyingly subtle, a flicker at the edge of perception, easily dismissed as a trick of the light or a momentary dizzy spell. But it was consistent. I tried to document it. I set my phone to record video, propping it up on my desk to capture myself as I worked, hoping to catch one of the involuntary micropauses and glances I now experienced even when walking short distances indoors. The footage was useless. Either I'd unconsciously move out of frame, or the recording would glitch at the crucial moment, a brief stutter, a block of pixelation, a burst of static on the audio. It was as if the phenomenon itself resisted observation. The people around me seemed to be sinking deeper into the rhythm of the 17. Their pauses were a fraction longer, their leftward glances more focused, their eyes holding a distant, vacant quality for a moment before returning to normal. The muttered phrases became slightly more uniform. I started hearing distinct, recurring phonetic clusters, Elivath. Ordu. Seek mens. They sounded like corrupted Latin, or perhaps fragments of a programming language I didn't recognize. The tally man's lexicon. The environmental cues also intensified. The flicker of streetlights wasn't random, they'd pulse softly, 17 times, then hold steady. The rain against my windowpane would sometimes fall in a rhythmic patter, tap tap tap, pause, tap tap tap, pause, 17 taps in distinct groupings. Cracks in the pavement seemed to branch and fork at angles that, if I squinted, hinted at the number 17. Was the city itself becoming a giant, resonating chamber for this frequency, this count? One Saturday, desperate for a connection, I posted an anonymous message on a fringe Seattle forum dedicated to anomalous experiences. I kept it vague. Anyone else notice a recurring number pattern in city behavior? A specific count? A shared gesture? Days passed with no response. I'd almost given up when a private message landed in my inbox. User, Stepwatcher 77. Message, the tally man sees you. 17 is the key. Are you listening to the spaces? My heart leaped. The spaces between the steps. I typed back. The zine. Who are you? The reply came quickly. A fellow listener. We should compare notes. The patterns are evolving. We arranged to meet, cautiously. A public place, a park bench overlooking Elliott Bay. I arrived early, my nerves raw. Stepwatcher 77 was a man named Arthur, probably in his late 50s, with tired eyes and clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. He carried a worn notebook filled with cramped handwriting and complex diagrams. It's the grid, see, he said, his voice raspy, tapping a page depicting a map of Seattle overlaid with an intricate web of lines and spirals, all intersecting at points marked with the number 17. They're tuning us. The whole city. It started subtly, years ago. The hum. Then the steps. It's a recalibration. Recalibration for what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Arthur looked out at the bay, his gaze distant. For what comes next? Or what's already here, and we're just being made to perceive it correctly. The 17 isn't just a count. It's a coordinate. A point of entry. Or exit. He told me he'd been tracking it for 5 years. He'd lost his job, his apartment. His family thought he was delusional. But I see it, don't you? He pleaded, his eyes fixing on mine. The way reality shimmers. On the 17th? I nodded slowly. Yes. A thinning. Relief washed over his face. Finally. Someone else. For a week, Arthur was my lifeline. We met several times, sharing observations. He showed me his maps, his theories about acoustic resonance, about how certain building materials amplified the effect. He believed the muttered phrases were attempts by people to verbalize the carrier wave of the phenomenon. He was obsessed, but he was also incredibly observant. He pointed out that birdsong near heavily affected areas sometimes seemed to incorporate sequences of 17 chirps. He noticed that automated systems, traffic lights, ATM queues, even the hold music on customer service lines, seemed to subtly glitch or pause to accommodate the 17-step rhythm. But my hope for a stable alliance was short-lived. Arthur was becoming more erratic. He started talking about ascending the count, about finding the prime 17 that would unlock the whole system. His diagrams became more frantic, his speech more fragmented. The last time I saw him, he was standing at a crosswalk downtown, not moving. He was simply turning his head left, then right, then left again, over and over, muttering, 16 17 18, 16 17 18, his eyes were wide, unseeing. He didn't recognize me. He had become consumed, another data point absorbed into the relentless count. The encounter left me colder and more frightened than before. There was no fighting this. There was only succumbing, or something else. Arthur's descent was a terrifying glimpse into a possible future. The pressure from the something counting was now a constant. It was like a low-grade fever in my mind. Resisting the 17th step glance brought on splitting headaches and a disorienting vertigo that made it impossible to function. I had to yield. It was becoming less of a distinct action and more a part of my natural gait, my way of being in the world. The city itself felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. The quiet contagion had spread. It was no longer a scattering of odd behaviors, it was the baseline. People moved with a subtle, shared rhythm, a synchronized pause and glance that was now so commonplace it was invisible to anyone not specifically attuned, or perhaps, to anyone who had fully integrated it. I felt myself on the precipice. The question was no longer if I would fall, but what I would find when I landed. The tally man, the resonance, the grid, whatever it was no longer just knocking at the door of my perception. It was beginning to seep through the walls. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't a battle against an external foe. There was no tally man to unmask, no hidden machine to disable. The confrontation was with the phenomenon itself, and with my own desperate need for the world to make sense in the way it once had. It happened on a day when the Seattle sky was an oppressive, unbroken gray, the kind that leaches color from everything and presses down with a tangible weight. I was walking, not to work, not from anywhere, just walking. My feet carried me along familiar streets, but my mind was elsewhere, caught in the loop of observation and dread. I reached a wide crosswalk. One I usually avoided, near the stadiums. It was long, easily 40 steps across. As I stepped off the curb, I knew the 17th step was coming, then another around the 34th. The compulsion was a familiar ache, a preemptive tightening in my neck. 16. 17. My head turned left. And this time, instead of fighting, instead of analyzing, instead of fearing, leaned into it. I let my gaze soften. I didn't try to see, I simply allowed myself to perceive. The world didn't tear open. There was no dramatic unveiling. But the subtle thinning I'd noticed before was more pronounced. The air over my shoulder seemed to vibrate, to shimmer not just with light, but with possibility. It was like looking at a heat haze over asphalt, but instead of distorted scenery, it was distorted space. And for the briefest fraction of a second, I had the vertiginous sensation of looking through something, not at something. As if reality were a projection on a slightly imperfect screen, and I was seeing the faint glow of the projector lamp behind it. The muttered phrase that escaped my lips this time wasn't a jumble. It was a single, clear word, spoken in a voice that was mine yet not mine, index. Then the moment passed. The world solidified. But something had shifted within me. The terror hadn't vanished, but it was now overlaid with a profound, almost detached, curiosity. I continued walking, and at the next 17th step, the 34th of that long crossing, I repeated the process. Leaned in. Aloud. This time, the shimmer was accompanied by a fleeting, internal image, an infinitely complex, shifting lattice of light, like a cosmic spiderweb, stretching in all directions. And I felt, with absolute certainty, that something that counted. It wasn't an entity. It was the lattice itself. The structure. The framework. We, the people of Seattle, perhaps the people of everywhere, were nodes within it, and the 17th step phenomenon was a calibration. A tuning. An alignment. The word that came to me then, synchronize. The true scale of it was incomprehensible. It wasn't a virus, not a toxin, not a government experiment. It felt more like a fundamental property of existence, a layer of the operating system of reality that had, for some reason, become active. Or perhaps it had always been active, and we were only now being made consciously, bodily, aware of its tick. The number 17. Arbitrary, perhaps. A cosmic constant we had no referent for, like the speed of light or Planck's constant, but for a different kind of physics. The muttered phrases, elevath. Or do. Seek mens. Index. Synchronize. They were like system calls, brief acknowledgments of processes running. There was no escape. How could you escape the framework of reality itself? Arthur's descent wasn't madness in the conventional sense, it was a deeper immersion, perhaps an attempt to interface too directly, too quickly, with something too vast. My isolation didn't end, but its nature changed. I was still separate in my awareness, but I was no longer fighting the current. I was part of the flow, a conscious particle in an unconsciously aligning stream. Life continued. I went to work at Innovate Solutions. I analyzed data. But my perception was forever altered. The patterns I saw in spreadsheets now seemed to echo the deeper pattern, the great count. I'd see 17 recurring in stock fluctuations, in server uptime reports, in the click-through rates of online ads. It was everywhere, hidden in plain sight, a silent testament to the underlying order. The people around me were, in a way, peaceful. The initial flicker of confusion or vacancy that had accompanied their 17th step glance was gone. It was now a smooth, integrated part of their movement, as natural as breathing. They were aligned. Harmonized. The city hummed with this new, quiet rhythm. There was no more overt weirdness, because the weirdness had become the norm. The contagion had run its course and settled into a new, stable state of being. I never found out why. Why now? Why Seattle? Was it spreading? I had no way of knowing. Perhaps the tally man was simply the universe's way of keeping its accounts. And we were the abacus beads, clicking into place. Sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet, I would walk. I'd count my steps to the crosswalk. 16. Then 17. I'd turn my head left, into the thin space, into the shimmer. I wouldn't try to understand. I would just acknowledge. System check, I'd think, the phrase forming effortlessly in my mind. And for a fleeting moment, I'd feel the vast, cool, indifferent intelligence of the framework, the silent, intricate dance of the cosmos itself, expressed in the simple, mundane act of a woman in Seattle taking her 17th step, and looking over her shoulder at the unseen. I hadn't escaped. I hadn't succumbed in the way Arthur had. I had adapted. I existed within the new, altered reality, forever changed, a tiny, aware cog in a machine whose purpose remained tantalizingly, terrifyingly, just beyond the veil of the 17th step. The quiet contagion was complete. And the counting went on. Threadbare. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The old linen shirt wasn't beautiful. Its original color, perhaps a soft sky blue or a muted lavender, had long surrendered to countless washes, fading to a shade I could only describe as worn. It was threadbare in places, particularly at the elbows and the curve of the collar, yet it held its shape with a stubborn integrity. It had belonged to my avu, my grandmother, a woman whose hands, like mine, had always sought the language of textiles. I'd found it tucked away in a cedar chest smelling of forgotten years, and initially, I'd worn it for sentiment. Now, I wore it for something else. My name is Alara, and I weave. Not just threads, but stories, emotions, the whispers of Lisbon's ancient stones into tapestries and art pieces. My studio, a small, sun-drenched room overlooking a bustling Alfama alley, was usually my sanctuary, filled with the scent of raw wool, dyed silks, and the metallic tang of my loom. Lately, though, the inspiration felt as thin as the morning mist over the Tagus. A creative block, I told myself. A common affliction. The shirt became my solace. It started subtly. I'd choose it from my wardrobe more often than not. Then, I began to notice the feel of it against my skin, a unique sensation, not just soft, but responsive. The fine, almost invisible nap of the aged linen seemed to sigh against my arm, a barely there caress that was intensely, singularly comforting. I found myself stroking the sleeve while sketching, my fingers tracing the almost imperceptible weave, losing minutes, then an hour, to the simple, repetitive motion. Stress, I murmured to my reflection one morning, the word tasting like an excuse. I was pulling the linen shirt over my head, the fabric cool and familiar. I had a meeting with a gallery owner, a smart dress would have been more appropriate, but the thought of wearing anything else felt abrasive. The linen settled around me like a second skin, and a small knot of anxiety I hadn't even fully acknowledged loosened in my chest. Lisbon, my vibrant, textured city, usually fueled my art. The chipped azulejo tiles underfoot, the rough-hewn stone of a Moorish wall, the smooth, sun-warmed iron of a tram rail, I absorbed it all. But now, my focus was narrowing, pulling inward, drawn to that singular tactile sensation of the shirt. The first real flicker of unease, the kind that prickles at the edge of consciousness, came not from myself but from Senora Aguiar. She lived across the narrow cobbled street, her window usually filled with blooming geraniums and the flash of her parakeet's wings. I saw her one Tuesday morning, not tending her flowers, but polishing her brass door knocker. She was a meticulous woman, her doorstep always swept, her windows gleaming, but this was different. Her hand, gnarled with age, moved in a slow, circular motion, over and over, her gaze distant, almost trance-like. The knocker, a lion's head, was already gleaming so fiercely it caught the sun in painful glints. I watched for 5 minutes. Her motion never wavered, never paused. Her lips were slightly parted, a faint sigh escaping them with each rotation of the cloth in her hand. I shook my head, a little disturbed. Just getting old, I muttered, walking towards the bakery for my morning pau com churrico. Old people developed routines, odd little habits. It was nothing. Later that week, at the cooperative studio space I sometimes used for larger projects, I saw Roy. He was a sculptor, usually a man of booming laughter and grand gestures, wrestling with clay or chipping aggressively at stone. Today, he was hunched over a small block of olive wood. He wasn't carving. He was sanding it. With a tiny piece of the finest grit sandpaper, he was stroking the wood, his eyes half closed, a look of profound, almost blissful concentration on his face. The wood was already smooth as silk, its grain luminous. "Roy?" I asked, approaching cautiously. "Is that for the new commission?" He didn't look up, just hummed softly. "The feel of it, Elara," he whispered, his calloused thumb stroking the wood. "Can you imagine? Like water, but warm. Solid water." I frowned. "It's very smooth." "Beyond smooth," he said, his voice husky. "It's complete." I left him to it, a strange disquiet settling in my stomach. His absorption was total, almost devotional. It wasn't the focus of an artist perfecting a detail, it was something else, something self-contained and unsettlingly serene. My own fixation with the linen shirt deepened. I wore it to bed. I'd wake in the night and my hand would be clutching the hem, my fingers rubbing the fabric. I started neglecting my loom. My commissioned piece, a tapestry inspired by the Fado singer Amalia Rodriguez, lay half-finished, its vibrant threads gathering a fine layer of dust. Instead, I'd sit by the window, the Lisbon light streaming in, and just feel the shirt. The way the threads yielded, the slight give, the almost imperceptible friction. It was more compelling than any pattern, any color. My friend, Ines, a sharp-tongued journalist with an uncanny ability to see through my deflections, called me out on it during our weekly coffee at a Brasileira. "Are you ever going to wear another shirt, Elara?" she asked, one eyebrow arched. "That thing looks like it's about to disintegrate. And you've got paint on the cuff." I instinctively touched the cuff, a smear of ochre I hadn't noticed. "It's comfortable." "Comfortable? You look like you've slept in it for a week." Which, knowing you and your current artistic temperament, she made air quotes, you probably have. "What's going on? Is it Miguel again?" Miguel was my ex, a topic Ines often prodded. "No, it's not Miguel. I'm just thinking. Working through some ideas. By molesting your clothes in public?" She grinned, but her eyes were searching. "You're distracted. More than usual." I tried to explain the unique quality of the linen, the almost living texture, but the words sounded hollow, obsessive even to my own ears. "It's just very good fabric." Ines snorted. "You're a textile artist, Elara. All your fabrics are very good. This is different. You're different." She tapped her pen against her notebook. "You're usually so aware of everything around you, the light, the sounds, the way that old man is trying to steal sugar packets. Now, you're just petting your sleeve." I flushed, pulling my hand away. She was right. I hadn't even noticed the man at the next table, his furtive glances towards the sugar bowl. My world had shrunk to the circumference of my arm, to the soft drag of thread against skin. The rationalizations continued. I was simply rediscovering the fundamentals of my craft, the pure, unadulterated sensation of material. It was a phase, a necessary regression before a creative leap. Or maybe it was the city itself, the ancientness of it, seeping into me, making me crave the touch of things that had endured. But then there were the children in the Praça das Flores, near my avó's old apartment where I now lived. They were usually a cacophony of shouts, laughter, and the thud of a football against the church wall. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench, ostensibly sketching but really just feeling the familiar comfort of my linen shirt, I noticed the silence. It wasn't an empty silence, but a hushed, focused quiet. A group of them, perhaps 5 or 6, aged between 7 and 10, were gathered near the fountain. They weren't playing. They were sitting in a circle, and one little girl, with pigtails the color of dark honey, was slowly, deliberately running her fingers over the frayed edge of a boy's denim shorts. He sat perfectly still, watching her hand. Then, she took a small, brightly colored ribbon from her pocket and pressed it into his palm. He closed his fingers around it, brought it to his cheek, and rubbed it gently, a look of serene concentration on his face. No words were exchanged. Another child offered a smooth, gray stone to a girl, who stroked it reverently before passing back a piece of velvet she'd produced from her own pocket. It was like a silent, solemn ritual. I watched, a knot tightening in my chest. This wasn't play as I knew it. This was something else, something absorbed and strangely adult in its intensity. Their parents were nearby, chatting on other benches, occasionally glancing over, but seemingly unconcerned by this new, silent communion. One mother, I noticed, was idly stroking the rough canvas of her shopping bag, her thumb tracing its weave with a repetitive, almost hypnotic rhythm. I tried to dismiss it. Kids are weird. They invent strange games. But the image of their small, serious faces, their complete absorption in the texture of these mundane objects, stayed with me. It echoed Rui's quiet ecstasy over his block of wood, Senora Aguiar's endless polishing. And it resonated, uncomfortably, with the growing, undeniable power the threadbare linen shirt held over me. The city continued its vibrant dance, the trams clattered, the fado still spilled from dimly lit taverns, but beneath the surface, I felt a subtle shift, a quiet hum of something new and strange. Or perhaps, I thought with a pang of genuine fear, the strangeness was only in me. Perhaps I was the one unraveling. My fingers sought the comfort of the linen, the familiar friction. It was still there, a constant in a world that was beginning to feel subtly, frighteningly out of focus. The threads felt finer than ever, as if whispering secrets only they, and now perhaps I, could understand. The days blurred into a routine dictated more by the shirt than by any external demand. I'd wake, and the first conscious thought would be the feel of the linen against my skin. Dressing in anything else felt like encasing myself in sandpaper or cold plastic. My work at the loom stalled completely. The vibrant yarns I'd once loved, the rich wools and shimmering silks, now felt coarse, lifeless, almost offensive to my touch. My fingers, trained to discern the most subtle variations in fiber, now only craved the singular sensation of that worn, ancient linen. My apartment, usually a riot of textures, chunky knit blankets, smooth ceramic bowls, tapestries in various stages of completion, started to feel overwhelming. I found myself subtly pushing aside cushions with nubby weaves, avoiding the cool smoothness of my marble tabletop. It was the linen, only the linen, that felt right. I began to document, not in a journal of words, but of sensation. I'd close my eyes and try to articulate, just to myself, what it was about the shirt. It wasn't just softness, I had softer cashmere. It wasn't just coolness, I had silk. It was something in the way the individual threads, worn thin by time, seemed to cling and release with a perfect, almost infinitesimal friction. It was like 1,000 tiny, gentle fingertips, constantly, reassuringly there. The sensory world outside the shirt was becoming muted, almost gray. The vivid colors of the Alfama street art seemed duller. The rich aroma of coffee and grilled sardines from the Toscas below my window was less enticing. Even sound seemed to reach me as if through a layer of cotton wool, or perhaps, a layer of old linen. I started to actively look for it in others, this, tactile preoccupation. And once I started looking, it was everywhere. A man on the number 28 tram, his eyes glazed over, rubbing his thumb back and forth across the worn leather strap hanging above him. Not just holding it for balance, but caressing it, his entire being focused on that small, repetitive motion. A woman at the Mercado de Ribera, ostensibly choosing tomatoes, but her fingers lingering on the smooth, taut skin of each one for an unnervingly long time, a faint smile on her lips. A businessman in Baixa, waiting for a taxi, compulsively smoothing the lapel of his expensive wool suit, over and over and over, his expression blank. These weren't grand, dramatic gestures. They were small, almost invisible, easily dismissed as nervous habits, moments of distraction. But they were too frequent, too similar in their quiet intensity. And the people exhibiting them shared a certain look, a subtle inwardness, a disengagement from their immediate surroundings, as if their primary reality had shifted to the point of contact between their skin and whatever surface they were touching. I tried to talk to Ines again, choosing my words more carefully this time. We met at our usual spot, the sun warming the checkered tablecloths outside a brazileira. Ines, I began, trying to sound casual, have you noticed, people seem a bit more, I don't know, focused on, touch lately. She took a sip of her galeo, her gaze sharp. Focused on touch. What do you mean? Like, are we talking a citywide outbreak of public indecency, or? No, not like that. I struggled for an example that wouldn't sound insane. Like, little things. People rubbing things. Their clothes, tables, you know. More than usual. She watched me for a moment, then her fingers, which had been resting on the slightly rough texture of the paper napkin beside her coffee cup, began to idly stroke it. Back and forth. Back and forth. People have always fidgeted, Elara. You're just noticing it more because, well, because of your own current shirt situation. She gestured towards my ever-present linen. But it's not just fidgeting, I insisted, feeling a familiar wave of frustration. It's absorbing. Like they're drawing something from it. Ines sighed, her fingers still moving on the napkin. Maybe they are. Maybe it's a new mindfulness trend. Find your center by feeling the table. God knows, there's a new wellness fad every week. She picked up the napkin, crumpled it, and tossed it into the ashtray. You need a new project, Elara. Something to take your mind off, textures. Her tone was light, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, concern, perhaps, or was it a faint, quickly suppressed understanding? Her dismissal, though gentle, deepened my sense of isolation. If Ines, my most grounded and observant friend, couldn't or wouldn't see it, then who would? Was I truly becoming unhinged? Was my artistic sensitivity curdling into paranoia? The children in Praca das Flores became my unwilling study group. I'd sit on my usual bench, sketching pad open on my lap as a pretext, and watch them. Their silent language of touch was evolving. They no longer just exchanged fabric scraps. They'd draw patterns on each other's arms with a feather, or a smooth pebble. They'd press different textures, a piece of bark, a discarded silk ribbon, a handful of soft moss, into each other's hands, their expressions solemn as they waited for a reaction, a tactile acknowledgement. Their verbal communication had dwindled to almost nothing. I hadn't heard a shout, a laugh, or even a cry from that group in weeks. Their parents, when they interacted, would often stroke their child's hair, or run a hand down their arm, lingering on the texture of their clothes, their responses equally muted, almost placid. One afternoon, a little girl with wide, dark eyes, the one who often initiated the exchanges, approached me. She didn't speak. She looked at the linen sleeve of my shirt, then at my face. Timidly, she reached out a small hand and lightly touched the fabric on my arm. Her fingers, feather-light, traced a seam. Her eyes, fixed on the movement, were incredibly focused. Then, she pulled a small, intricately knotted piece of red string from her pocket and pressed it into my palm. It was rough, but with a complex, surprisingly pleasing texture. She looked at me expectantly. My heart hammered. This was communication. I closed my fingers around the string, feeling its bumps and ridges. I tried to smile. Obrigada, I whispered. She didn't react to my word, only to the pressure of my fingers on the string. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Then she turned and walked back to her silent circle. I looked at the knotted string in my hand. It felt significant, a message I couldn't decipher. A desperate urge to understand, to connect with someone who acknowledged this shifting reality, warred with a primal fear of what that understanding might entail. My small apartment, once a comforting cocoon, began to feel like a cage lined with the wrong kind of textures. I started hiding things, the velvet cushion went into a cupboard, the rough sisal rug was rolled up and shoved under the bed. Only the linen shirt felt safe. I bought another one, almost identical, from a vintage store, thinking I could alternate, wash one while wearing the other. But the new one, though old and soft, was wrong. It didn't have the same frequency. It felt dead against my skin. Only my avos shirt held the magic, the quiet hum that both soothed and consumed me. Sleep became difficult. Not because of insomnia, but because waking felt like being torn from a warm, perfect embrace. The world outside the shirt felt increasingly hostile, its myriad textures an assault on my heightened senses. I began to wonder if the shirt wasn't just comforting me, but changing me, tuning me to a different wavelength. A wavelength where only certain tactile sensations registered as meaningful, and everything else was just noise. The breaking point, or perhaps the point of no return, came on a gray, drizzly Tuesday. I'd run out of milk. The simple act of going to the corner shop, a journey of less than 200 meters, felt like an expedition into a hostile landscape. The cool, damp air on my exposed face felt alien. The familiar cobblestones under my thin-soled shoes, each one a distinct, jarring pressure. The metallic chill of the shop door handle. Inside, the usual cheerful proprietor, Señor Vasconcelos, was behind the counter. He was a portly man, always ready with a joke or a comment on the weather. Today, he was silent. His gaze was fixed on the worn wooden counter. His right hand, palm down, was slowly, rhythmically stroking the wood. Back and forth, back and forth. His breathing was shallow, his lips slightly parted. He didn't look up when I entered. "Señor Vasconcelos," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond. His hand continued its patient, endless caress of the wood. A wave of dizziness washed over me. It wasn't just the children, or Roy, or Señora Aguiar. It was spreading. Or perhaps, my perception of it was spreading, like a stain. I fumbled for a carton of milk, my hand clumsy. The cold, smooth plastic of the carton felt repulsive. I placed the money on the counter, next to his moving hand. He didn't acknowledge it. I backed away, milk clutched in my numb fingers, and fled the shop. Back in my apartment, I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, the linen shirt clinging to me like a lifeline. The world outside wasn't just subtly wrong anymore. It was actively, terrifyingly strange. And I was alone in seeing it. Or, worse, I was becoming part of it, my old self slowly being rubbed away, replaced by something that only understood the language of threadbare linen. My gaze fell on my loom, dusty and silent. The vibrant threads mocked me. They were from a world I no longer fully inhabited, a world of extroverted sensation, of communication through color and pattern. My new world was hushed, internal, communicated through the infinitesimal friction of fiber against skin. I clutched the sleeve of my shirt, burying my face in its familiar, worn softness. It was the only thing that made sense. The only thing that felt real. And a terrifying thought began to coalesce. What if this wasn't an ending, but a beginning? What if the shirt was an invitation? Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The incident at Señor Vasconcelos' shop was a tipping point. The veil of plausible deniability, already worn thin, ripped entirely. I could no longer rationalize, no longer dismiss the creeping tactile fixation as coincidence or my own overactive imagination. It was real, it was spreading, and the silence accompanying it was the most unnerving part. My isolation deepened. How could I explain to Ines, or anyone, that our local grocer had been hypnotized by his countertop? She'd recommend a psychiatrist, or a long holiday. The chasm between my perceived reality and the reality others seemed to inhabit yawned wider with each passing day. I started a new kind of journal. Not of feelings, but of observations, meticulously recorded. October 17th, Praca das Flores. Children. No spoken words observed for 12 days. Exchanged, smooth piece of sea glass, tuft of cat fur, Persian, long, strip of sun-faded silk. Elder boy, Joao, spent 20 minutes rubbing a patch of moss on the fountain base. His mother, nearby, repeatedly stroked the textured plastic handle of her pram. October 19th, Tram 28. Estimated 40% of passengers exhibiting tactile fixation. Man with briefcase, leather, worn smooth, caressing its surface. Woman, silk scarf, rubbing it against her cheek. Young student, canvas backpack, tracing its weave with a pen cap. General atmosphere, subdued, almost reverent quiet. October 22nd, Alfama. Señora Aguiar. No longer polishing knocker. Now sits on her doorstep, stroking the rough, sun-baked stone of her house wall. Expression, placid. Does not respond to greetings. The city, my beloved Lisbon, was transforming before my eyes into a landscape of silent, tactile rituals. Familiar places became alien. The chatter of cafes, the lively arguments in the market, the boisterous calls of street vendors, all were subtly, increasingly muted, replaced by a pervasive hush, broken only by the whisper of fabric, the drag of a hand across a surface. My research attempts were fruitless. I scoured the internet for mass sensory fixation, epidemic tactile obsession, collective textural hypnosis. I found articles on ASMR, on the therapeutic benefits of touch, on fidget toys. Nothing remotely matched the scale or the unnerving quietness of what I was witnessing. It was as if this phenomenon existed outside the bounds of known psychology or sociology. My own world continued to shrink, defined by the parameters of the linen shirt. It was my armor against the increasingly abrasive textures of the outside world, and my lens through which this new, silent reality was focused. Other fabrics felt like lies, garish and loud. The linen was truth, a quiet, constant whisper. I began to fear washing it, terrified that even the gentle cycle of my machine might strip away some essential quality, some infinitesimal part of its magic. I'd hand wash it with the utmost care, using unscented soap, drying it flat, my anxiety mounting until it was dry and I could once again feel its familiar embrace. One rain-swept afternoon, driven by a desperate need for something, anything, to break the pattern of my days, I ventured further than usual, towards the Chiato district. The streets here were wider, the shops more elegant. And there, nestled between a centuries-old bookbinder and a chic modern patisserie, was a shop I had never seen before. It had no name, at least not one I could see. The shop front was a single, vast pane of smoked glass, offering only a dim, obscured view of the interior. There were no mannequins, no vibrant displays, just a subtle, almost subliminal suggestion of fabric draped in deep shadows. It hadn't been there last week, I was certain of it. I walked this route occasionally, and a new establishment of this size wouldn't have escaped my notice. A strange compulsion drew me closer. The smoked glass seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light, giving nothing away. I pressed my face closer, cupping my hands around my eyes. Inside, I could just make out shapes, racks, perhaps, hung with garments. But it was the quality of the light, or lack thereof, and a certain stillness within that held me captive. It felt different. Like a pocket of denser reality. As I hesitated, the door, a seamless panel of the same smoked glass, hissed open a few inches, as if in invitation. No one was visible. Just the faintest scent, elusive and strange, drifted out, not lanolin, not cedar, not any perfume I could identify. It was earthy, yet metallic, with an undertone of something ancient, like dust from a place untouched by sunlight for millennia. My heart pounded. This was wrong. This shop was wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to run back to the familiar, if unsettling, confines of my linen-wrapped world. But another part of me, the part that was increasingly attuned to the subtle, the textural, the silent, was undeniably drawn in. I pushed the door open. The interior was dim, lit by cleverly concealed sources that cast long, soft shadows. The air was cool and still, the strange scent more pronounced. Racks of clothing lined the walls, but not packed tightly as in a normal store. Each garment hung with ample space around it, presented like a museum piece. And the fabrics. My breath caught. I was a textile artist. I knew fabrics. I knew weaves, fibers, finishes. I had never seen anything like these. There was a cloak that seemed woven from solidified night, its surface drinking the light, yet with a texture that shimmered under my tentative touch like 1,000 tiny, cool scales. A dress, the color of old parchment, felt like flower petals pressed and preserved for centuries, impossibly delicate yet strong. Trousers that seemed made of a material like liquid stone, flowing yet with a subtle, granular resistance. There were no price tags. No salespeople. Just the silent, potent allure of these impossible textiles. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched a sleeve. It was a deep, mossy green, and the fabric felt alive. Not warm, but possessing a kind of subtle vibration, a hum that resonated deep in my bones, harmonizing with the familiar sensation of my own linen shirt. I wanted to bury my face in it, to wrap myself in its alien comfort. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and slender, emerged from the deeper shadows at the back of the shop. They were androgynous, dressed in a simple, dark garment of a material I couldn't quite identify. It seemed to shift and flow like smoke. Their face was serene, their eyes holding a calm, knowing expression. They didn't speak, just inclined their heads slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps of welcome. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the strange allure. I snatched my hand back from the green sleeve. I'm just looking, I stammered, my voice sounding harsh and loud in the profound quiet. The figure offered a faint, enigmatic smile. I backed away, towards the door, my gaze darting around the shop. I saw other browsers now, half hidden in the alcoves, their movements slow, entranced. A woman was stroking a shawl the color of bruised plums, her eyes closed, a look of ecstatic peace on her face. A man ran his hands reverently over a coat that seemed woven from moonlight and mist. They were like the people on the tram, the people in the cafes, but here, their absorption was legitimized, catered to. This shop was a haven for them, a temple to this new, silent faith of texture. I stumbled out into the rain-slicked street, gasping as if I'd been holding my breath. The ordinary sounds of the city, a car horn, distant music, the chatter of passers-by, rushed in, feeling suddenly cacophonous, almost violent after the profound stillness of the shop. The new shop, I started calling it Fios do Silencio, threads of silence, in my mind, though I'd seen no sign, became an obsession within my obsession. I couldn't stay away. I wouldn't go in again, not yet, but I found myself drawn to its vicinity, watching from across the street, hidden in a doorway. People went in. People I recognized from my neighborhood, from the trams. People who had exhibited the subtle tactile fixations. They entered with a kind of quiet purpose and emerged later, sometimes carrying sleek, unmarked bags, their faces serene, distant. They never seemed to look at anything else, just moved with a newfound, focused calm. The children in Praca das Flores began to wear new items of clothing. A little girl had a scarf of that impossible, light-devouring black. One of the boys wore gloves of a material that clung to his hands like a second skin, its texture subtly iridescent. These weren't clothes their working-class parents could afford from any normal Chiado boutique. And when they touched these new fabrics, their silent communion seemed to deepen, their movements becoming even more fluid, more expressive in their tactile language. A secondary, more personal mystery began to unfold. Small things started to go missing from my studio. Not valuables, but specific textiles. A rare bolt of hand-spun Japanese indigo cotton. A small, antique lace collar I'd been hoarding for years. A sample of tapestry woven with metallic threads that had a peculiar, almost sharp texture. At first, I thought I'd misplaced them, my mind increasingly fogged by my linen shirt dependency. But the disappearances were too specific. It was always items with unique, pronounced textures. Then, I started finding things. Small, unfamiliar scraps of fabric in my apartment. A tiny square of something that felt like dried moss, yet was incredibly resilient. A thread of what looked like spun glass, cool and smooth. They would appear on my windowsill, or tucked into the pocket of a coat I hadn't worn in weeks. They felt like offerings. Or warnings. My research shifted. I abandoned psychological terms and started looking into folklore, into forgotten cults, into whispers of things that existed at the edge of perception. I found nothing concrete, only allegories of beings who wove fate, of creatures who communicated through patterns, of garments that altered the wearer. It was all myth, of course. But the line between myth and the reality of Fios do Silencio was becoming terrifyingly blurred. I tried, once more, to confide in someone. This time, it was Dr. Alvarez, my old art history professor from the university, a man whose knowledge of obscure textile traditions was encyclopedic. I invited him for coffee, ostensibly to discuss my stalled Amalia Rodriguez tapestry. "Ilara, my dear, you look tired," he said, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. He was a man whose own attire was a testament to texture: tweed jackets, corduroy trousers, silk cravats. I described, carefully, the children's tactile language, framing it as a new form of folk art, a spontaneous expression. They don't speak, Professor. They communicate entirely through touching fabrics, passing them between each other. It's quite extraordinary. He listened intently, stroking the worn leather binding of the old book he always carried. Fascinating, he murmured, his fingers tracing the raised lettering on the cover. A pre-verbal communication, perhaps. A return to a more primal sensory engagement. Children are often more attuned to these things. His gaze was distant, his fingers never ceasing their exploration of the book's texture. And there are others, I pressed on, my voice hushed. Adults. Becoming fixated on the feel of things. Their clothes, furniture. It's as if the texture itself is important. Dr. Alvarez nodded slowly. The language of materials, Ilara. We've forgotten it, in our noisy, visual world. But the body remembers. The skin remembers. His thumb rubbed a faded gold embossment on the book's spine. This binding, for instance. Moroccan leather, 18th century. The way it has yielded to centuries of hands, it speaks. Can you feel it? He pushed the book towards me. His eyes were bright, too bright. And his focus was entirely on the book. He hadn't really heard my fear, only the part that resonated with his own lifelong passion. But now, that passion seemed different. Sharpened. Consuming. He started talking about the tactile qualities of ancient Coptic weaves, the sensory richness of medieval tapestries, his voice growing softer, more reverent, his fingers constantly stroking, smoothing, caressing the old leather. He was lost to me, another soul drawn into the quiet, enveloping world of pure texture. I left him there, still murmuring to his book, a profound sense of desolation washing over me. There were no allies. There was only the creeping silence, the relentless focus on feel. And the ominous presence of Fios do Silencio, its smoked glass window reflecting a distorted, muted Lisbon. My world was now sharply divided, the reality of the linen shirt, its comforting, all-consuming presence, and the reality outside it, a world increasingly populated by silent, touch-obsessed individuals and inexplicable phenomena. I was an island, drifting further and further from any recognizable shore, with only the threadbare fabric against my skin as my compass and my anchor. And I was beginning to suspect that the destination it was leading me to was not one I would have chosen, but one that was, perhaps, choosing me. The small scraps of alien fabric continued to appear in my apartment. One morning, I found a perfect, iridescent scale, no bigger than my thumbnail, resting on the warm linen of my pillow. It felt cool, smooth, and impossibly thin. I touched it, and a faint, almost subliminal hum resonated through my fingertip, a sensation that was both deeply strange and disturbingly familiar. It felt like a purer, more concentrated version of the comfort my shirt provided. The thought, terrifying and seductive, began to form: was my shirt a primer? A gateway? Had its years of wear, its absorption of my Abues life and my own, somehow attuned it, and me, to this quiet contagion? Was Fios do Silencio the source, or merely a symptom, a gathering place for those already touched? The days grew shorter, the Lisbon light taking on a softer, more melancholic hue. The quiet in the city, or at least in my perception of it, deepened. It was no longer just the absence of noise, but a presence in itself, a heavy, velvet silence that seemed to absorb sound, to dampen the world. And in that silence, the subtle whisper of textures grew louder, more insistent, calling to something deep within me, something that the old linen shirt had awakened. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The nature of the threat, if threat it was, remained maddeningly elusive. Was it a psychological contagion, a mass hysteria born of unspoken anxieties? Was Fios do Silencio a purveyor of fabrics treated with some unknown chemical, subtly altering brain chemistry through dermal absorption? Or was it something far stranger, an entity, an intelligence, communicating and expanding its influence through the medium of touch, weaving itself into the very fabric of our reality? My journal entries became more speculative, more desperate. I began to experiment, tentatively. I'd take one of the found scraps, the moss-like square, the thread of spun glass, and hold it, focusing on its texture, trying to understand its voice. Each one had a distinct feel, a unique resonance. The mossy square pulsed with a slow, earthy rhythm. The glass thread hummed with a cool, clear energy. They were like notes in a silent symphony, and my linen shirt, I realized, was the tuning fork. The children in Praca das Flores were my most consistent point of reference. Their silent world was becoming more intricate. They no longer just exchanged fabrics, they began to weave with them, creating small, abstract sculptures in the park. Twisted ribbons, knotted scraps of yarn, leaves stitched together with tough grasses, these objects would appear overnight, perched on benches or nestled at the roots of trees. They were like strange, silent totems, their meaning obscure but their tactile presence undeniable. Other adults in the park, those already showing signs of the fixation, would sometimes pause and gently touch these creations, a flicker of understanding in their otherwise placid eyes. One afternoon, I saw them gathered around a new, larger construction. It was a kind of loose, three-dimensional tapestry, strung between two lampposts, made from an astonishing array of materials: plastic bags, strips of old newspaper, unraveled wool from discarded sweaters, shimmering crisp packets, even strands of human hair. It was chaotic yet strangely ordered, its overall effect unsettlingly organic. And woven into its heart, I saw a flash of familiar deep indigo, the exact shade and texture of the Japanese cotton missing from my studio. A cold dread seeped into me. They weren't just finding these materials. They were acquiring them. Or perhaps, the materials were being provided. My investigation into FIOS do Silencio intensified. I couldn't bring myself to enter again, not after that first disorienting encounter, but I watched it like a hawk. I noticed patterns. The deliveries, always at pre-dawn hours, were made by unmarked vans, their drivers moving with an eerie, silent efficiency. They unloaded long, flat boxes, their contents hidden. The individuals who frequented the shop were often artists, designers, people whose lives already revolved around aesthetics and sensory input. But increasingly, I saw ordinary people too, office workers, shop assistants, even a uniformed policeman once, emerging with that telltale serene expression and an unmarked bag. The secondary mystery of my missing fabrics and the appearance of alien scraps in my apartment began to feel less like a subplot and more like a direct line of communication. Was I being tested? Groomed? Was my unique sensitivity to texture, amplified by my AVOS shirt, making me a candidate for something? The stakes escalated in a way that was quiet yet profoundly disturbing. I heard through neighborhood gossip that Senora Aguiar had been taken away by her concerned family. She'd apparently rubbed the skin on her hands raw, down to the bleeding quick, by incessantly stroking the stone wall of her house. She hadn't spoken a word in weeks. Señor Vasconcelos had closed his shop. Someone had peered through the window and seen him sitting in the dim interior, endlessly polishing a single, tarnished silver coin, oblivious to the world. These weren't acts of violence, but of utter, self-consuming obsession. The individuals weren't aggressive, they were simply retreating. Withdrawing from the shared, noisy world into a private, silent universe of pure sensation. I had to understand the source. Was it the shop? Was it something older, deeper? The linen shirt felt thinner than ever, almost translucent in places. I feared its eventual disintegration, the loss of my only constant, my only shield. One evening, examining it by the lamplight, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Embedded deep within the weave, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a single, alien thread. It was finer than a spider's silk, with a faint, almost imperceptible luminescence, like the scale I'd found on my pillow. It wasn't cotton, it wasn't linen. It was something else. My blood ran cold. Had it always been there? A seed? Had my Avu, a weaver herself, unknowingly incorporated it into her mending, or had it found its way there through some other, stranger means? Was this thread the source of my fixation, the thing that had primed me? The idea that the contagion might have started with me, with this beloved heirloom, was a horrifying thought. Was I a patient zero, unknowingly spreading this quiet malady through my own heightened sensitivity, my own deep connection to this singular piece of fabric? Desperate for an ally, anyone who might see even a fraction of what I was seeing, I thought of Roy, the sculptor. He'd been one of the first I'd noticed. Perhaps his artistic sensibility, his initial blissful absorption, hadn't completely consumed him. I found him in his shared studio space, not working on his monumental stone pieces, but sitting at a small table, meticulously arranging tiny pebbles of varying textures on a piece of black velvet. His earlier bliss had been replaced by a gaunt, hollow-eyed intensity. "Roy?" I said softly. He looked up, his eyes focusing on me with difficulty. "Ilara." His voice was a dry rasp. "The textures, they speak. Such quiet voices. You have to listen very carefully." He gestured to his pebbles. "This one," he picked up a rough, porous piece of volcanic rock, "it holds the memory of fire." He stroked it gently. "And this one, a smooth, river-worn stone, sings of water and time." "Roy," I tried again, my voice trembling slightly. "There's a shop. Fios do Silencio. In Chiado. The fabrics there, they're like nothing I've ever seen. Do you know it?" A flicker of something crossed his face, recognition, fear, or perhaps just a deeper level of absorption. "The threads, they bind," he whispered, his gaze drifting back to his pebbles. "They quiet the noise. The world is too loud, Ilara. Too many sharp edges. Here, it's smooth. It's whole." He was too far gone. He wasn't an ally, he was a testament to the contagion's power. His artistic exploration had become a trap, his sensitivity a vulnerability. The city itself seemed to be colluding. Streetlights began to flicker in unusual, almost rhythmic patterns at night, patterns that seemed to echo the silent, weaving motions I saw everywhere. Shadows in narrow alleyways sometimes seemed to lengthen or twist in impossible ways when I glanced at them from the corner of my eye. Mundane objects, a discarded scarf on a railing, a pile of newspapers left for collection, would sometimes appear to be subtly rearranged when I looked away and then looked back, forming new, fleeting textural compositions. Was the environment itself becoming, textured, responsive? Or was my perception so altered that I was projecting this obsession onto everything around me? One evening, I forced myself to walk past Fios do Silencio again. The smoked glass door was slightly ajar. From within, I heard no voices, no music, just a profound, absorbing silence that seemed to draw the very air towards it. And then, I saw it, displayed in the dim window, previously empty, was a single garment. A simple, tunic-like shirt. It was the exact shade of my own faded linen shirt. The cut was almost identical. But the fabric, even from across the street, I could sense it. It pulsed with a quiet energy, a depth of texture that made my own beloved shirt feel suddenly, crude, a mere echo. It was as if my shirt was the sketch, and this was the finished masterpiece. It was an invitation. A direct, undeniable summons. My breath hitched. The alien thread in my own shirt suddenly felt like a tether, pulling me towards this new, purer source. The shop wasn't just selling clothes, it was offering an evolution, a transcendence into a world of pure tactile experience. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But now, it was mingled with a strange, irresistible curiosity, a longing to understand, to feel what that shirt in the window represented. The city continued its hushed transformation. More shops seemed to have fewer customers, their owners often engaged in their own quiet, repetitive tactile rituals. The Fadu from the taverns, when I heard it, sounded mournful, like a lament for a world that was fading. I realized the true horror wasn't violence or chaos. It was this slow, quiet unraveling of shared reality, the gentle descent into a solipsistic world of individual sensory obsession. Communication was breaking down, replaced by a silent, internal communion with texture. Society, as I knew it, was fraying at the edges, its threads loosening one by one. My own linen shirt, my constant companion, felt increasingly inadequate. The comfort it offered was now tinged with a sense of incompleteness.